Chapter 401. Ran Zai wasn't angry at Silen's hypnosis. After all, he came from the military, and he knew a little about hypnosis. He knew that Silen meant no harm. At first, Ran Zai just wanted to see if Silen was lying from Silen's eyes, but he fell for it himself. It was easier for a person to trigger their true emotions through eye contact. Ran Zai was excited just now. He had been holding it in for more than 20 years, and he had always wanted to vent the words in his heart. However, it was a secret that could not be made public. Only a handful of people knew about it, and it could only be buried in history. Silen, on the other hand, only played the role of a primer. He didn't forcefully interfere with Ran Zai's emotions, and that was why Ran Zai wasn't angry. Ran Zai had said everything he wanted to say, and Silen didn't force him to say anything else. Ran Zai remained tight-lipped. That was enough. Back then, Silen learned the general situation of the taper eradication incident from Wuxia, and today he learned more detailed information from Ran Zai. Many of his doubts were answered now. The person who owed Si Fang a favor and took Bian Hu away was the current leader of Fire Phoenix, the current Fire Phoenix. Only this person had the ability to protect Bian Hu from the fire back then. The current Fire Phoenix fulfilled his promise, and he didn't force Bian Hu no matter how much he thought highly of her. He respected Bian Hu's choice and allowed her to roam freely when the prison was still there. Now, he did the same. Moreover, Bian Hu had received some help from Si Huang. Up until now, Bian Hu hadn't encountered any serious threat to her life. At least, that was what Bian Hu showed others. Due to Ran Zai's occupation, he couldn't explain the nightmare taper in detail, and he didn't provide much help to Silen. However, he told Silen that if he wanted to know more about the nightmare taper, he could look for a person, Onesta. Onesta was one of the officers under Si Fang's command, and he had participated in the taper eradication operation. Just like Ran Zai, he wasn't locked up in the highest prison, and survived to this day. He was absorbed by Sector S's forces. Most importantly, Onesta's profession was important. Back then, Onesta was a military doctor. He was valued by Si Fang because he could follow a military doctor to the front line. It went without saying that he should know a lot more about the nightmare taper. Onesta wasn't in Fire Phoenix. A long time ago, before the prison was revoked, and everyone was thrown into the prison after being stripped of their military uniforms. Compared to Ran Zai and the others, Onesta was treated better. This was because there were people to take care of him. Many knew that the prison system of Sector had connections with the local forces. Fang. Sector S's prison had Sector had. And Bar. Pen. Queen was the queen, and queen had was Sector. Onesta was one of Angenia's targets, and they had grown familiar with each other. That was why Angenia had sent someone to fetch Onesta as soon as the prison was revoked. Once Silen arrived at Golden Beginning, he would be able to find Onesta and learn more about the situation. The people Angenia sent to fetch Silen soon arrived, and they were led by Zhen Xingfu. Zhen Xingfu's gene rank had skyrocketed after the second injection, and his physique was like heaven and earth compared to before. However, Zhen Xingfu still gave off the impression that he was as thin and weak as he was before. There were two reasons why Zhen Xingfu looked thin and weak. First, they didn't want to make it public. Zhen Xingfu had kept the fact that his physique had changed a secret, and no one except the few closest people knew that his, Zhen Xingji, and Gensheng's innate qualities had changed drastically. In the past, they could only rely on their bodyguards to assassinate them, and if their bodyguards were unreliable, they could only rely on weapons and protective equipment. If none of those worked, then they could only pray for their own good. But now, they might be able to deliver a fatal blow to their target when they weren't paying attention. Secondly, Zhen Xingfu's attire was loose and empty. Angenia must have purposely designed it so that he would look the same as before, and Zhen Xingfu's deliberate disguise was enough to fool people. Although Zhen Xingfu still gave off the impression that he was as thin and weak as he used to be, his temperament had changed. Just like Pianhua said, Zhen Xingfu was a lot brighter than before. He was no longer as gloomy and fickle as before. We finally meet again, Silen. Zhen Xingfu strode forward and fist-bumped Silen. At the same time, he also greeted Hui Mao, who was lying on Silen's shoulder. Hui Mao responded politely. Zhen Xingfu was the descendant of his second grandpa's master, so he counted as one of his own. Of course he had to treat his own people differently. Ran Zai watched the conversation between Zhen Xingfu and Silen from the side. He knew that Engenia valued Silen a lot, but he didn't think that Silen and Zhen Xingfu would be this close. There were a lot of people in Sector S who knew that the Zhen family were untrustworthy and unapproachable people. However, it was obvious that Zhen Xingfu was familiar with Silen, and the smile on his face wasn't formal or perfunctory. It was sincere. Ran Zai's opinion of Silen rose even higher. Yo, young Master Fu, I can't believe you're the one who led the team here. How rare! Pian Hua exclaimed. They were all acquaintances, so they spoke more casually than usual. Everyone in their generation had worked together before the three great forces came to power, so they knew each other very well. Of course. It's rare for Silen to show up, so it's only natural that we come to welcome him. Zhen Xingfu chatted with Ran and Pian Hua for a bit longer before he dragged Silen away like he was in a hurry. His grandmother was still waiting for him at Golden Beginnings headquarters. After Golden Beginnings Starship had left, Pian Hua stroked his fake beard and said, I can't shake the feeling that Engenia and the Zhen family are too close to Silen. They almost look like family. I would have thought the same if there wasn't no concrete proof after multiple investigations, Ran Zai replied. As one of the three great forces, they had investigated the leaders of Golden Beginning many times before. However, there was no evidence that Queen Engenia had another child, and Zhen Xing only had a son and a daughter. Have you found anything about Queen Engenia's husband? Pian Hua asked. No. That person is too mysterious, and he's still a mystery to this day. Ran Zai had investigated the trash that the elders of Sector S mentioned many times, but the more he investigated, the more puzzled he became. The trash that everyone mentioned was familiar with the Food King, and his origins were unknown. It was said that he was a person from outside of Sector S, and he disappeared after that. Some people said that the trash was dead because his gene rank was very low, and he couldn't support a long lifespan. He had already started aging when he disappeared back then, so one could only imagine what had happened to him after so many years had passed. However, Ran Zai couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Queen Engenia was a famous person in Sector S, and she was the one who single-handedly developed Golden Beginning to its current scale and status. However, the trash that everyone called Zhen family had always been in her heart. If he really was a trash without any merits, how could the great Queen of Golden Beginning have been obsessed with him for so many years? How could he be so close to the Food King, so close to the extent that the Food King would mercilessly slap his own children and descendants away if they spoke ill of him? Pian Hua suddenly thought of something and asked Ran Zai, what was the name of the person you mentioned back then? Ran Zai thought for a moment and answered, I remember. His name was Genya. Genya? Pian Hua sucked in a deep breath. The planet I visited this time is the birthplace of Silen. I learned that Silen's master is also called Genya. Pian Hua didn't know about Genya because Silen told her. She learned it from the information of the local population, and she had investigated the little yard when she chose it as a shelter. She heard that the owner of the yard had been dead for many years. Is what you said true? Ran Zai was surprised. If it was true, then the trash that everyone called him back then wasn't trash after all. At the very least, a person who could raise a disciple like Silen was definitely no ordinary person. I remember that there was a tree in that yard that looked very similar to the one I saw at Golden Beginnings headquarters. Although I could only catch a glimpse of it at Golden Beginning and couldn't see it up close, I'm sure it's the same kind of tree. That kind of tree was very special and strange. Pian Hua had been to many places, but she had never seen a tree similar to the one at Golden Beginning. However, the almost bald tree in Silen's yard was the same kind of tree as the one at Golden Beginning. While Pianhua and Ranzai were discussing Silen and Genya, Zhen Xingfu had brought Silen and the others to Golden Beginnings headquarters. This time, Angenia and Zhenxing welcomed them personally. Unlike last time, there were two more people this time. One was Zhen Xingfu's younger sister, Zhen Xingji, and the other was the star hunter Prisa who often kept Zhen Xingji here. This was the first time Silen met Prisa. She was Zhen Xingfu's aunt, and it was impossible to tell her age based on her appearance. However, the temperament and charm that flowed out of her every movement told everyone that she wasn't a young girl who knew nothing, but someone who had experienced many things and had a story to tell. There were rumors that Prisa and Zhenxing were biological siblings, and that they were both born to Angenia. However, there were other theories as well. In short, Prisa's background was a mystery to many people. That being said, Silen knew that Prisa and Zhenxing couldn't be biological siblings. Prisa didn't have the Zhen family's bloodline, and she had displayed great strength and high gene rank from the very beginning. She wasn't like Zhenxing and the others who had the Zhen family's bloodline. Moreover, Silen believed that Angenia wouldn't look for another man. However, Prisa must have a lot of connections to become a star hunter, and it was far beyond anyone's imagination. After all, Sector S was a prison sector back in the day. Anything could happen in a place like this. Angenia, who always gave off a dignified image, smiled lovingly when she saw Silen. She pulled Silen to her side and spoke to him. Those who had seen this before were immune to it, but those who hadn't were completely stunned by it. Even if they didn't show it on their faces, they were shocked to the core. Is this Silen the queen's illegitimate son? Or is he Boss Yuan's illegitimate son? That being said, young Master Fu wouldn't be smiling so happily if he was Boss Yuan's illegitimate son. The smiles on these people's faces weren't faked. Zhen Xingji and her older brother were standing behind their father and grandmother. They were staring curiously at the young man who was chatting happily with her grandmother. He looked to be about the same age as her, so how did he make her serious grandmother smile like that? That's the kind of smile a grandmother should have toward a junior, isn't it? It was pitifully rare for her and her older brother to smile like this. Angenia brought Silen to the courtyard where the Fuji tree was planted. There were a few Fuji trees that were growing pretty well in the courtyard. The reason why the Fuji tree was called the upper tree was because it was special compared to other plants. It could grow 10 years in 1 year, or it could not grow even a centimeter in 10 years. It all depended on the mood of the tree, and the main factor that affected the tree's mood was the Zhen family. The tree would only grow in a place where the Zhen family was present. For example, the Fuji tree was growing very well when Genya was still in the courtyard on planet Brown Earth. It was so lush that it looked like a 100-year-old tree in just a short time. However, the tree stopped growing after Genya left, and it was growing worse every year. The Fuji tree in Golden Beginnings courtyard might not be as good as the tree in the courtyard on planet Brown Earth, but it was still a rare sight. Perhaps Genya didn't expect that the seeds he gave to Angenia as a gift would grow to such an extent, right? Very few people could enter this courtyard. Even Pianhua, who came with Fire Phoenix as a guest, could only look at it through the wall. Therefore, Silen didn't have to worry too much about this place. Here. Angenia looked around the courtyard, wondering if she should find a better empty space. Silen waved his hand and pointed at a spot in the middle of the trees. That's fine. As he said this, Silen walked over and crouched down on the empty space in the middle of the trees. He stretched out his finger and pressed the curly leaf pattern against the ground. The next moment, there was a crackling sound. A large tree seemed to break out of the ground. Although it was bald, its branches were thicker than the branches of the trees in the courtyard. Following the appearance of this tree, the surrounding trees first moved outwards, as if to make room for this tree. After the tree appeared and stabilized, they all moved closer to it. After the tree broke out of the ground, its roots under the ground began to grow. It was here that it sensed a familiar presence that it hadn't seen for a long time. This made it very happy. The immediate reaction of its happiness was that green buds began to sprout on its originally bald branches. The buds grew larger and denser. Zhen Xingfu and the others were stunned. Even Zhensheng and Engenia, who had some understanding of the Fuji tree, were stunned by this scene. Engenia knew that the Fuji tree had spirit energy. Zhenya had told her many things about this tree, but she had never seen it with her own eyes. This was the first time she had felt it so deeply. Engenia knew that the Fuji tree had spiritual energy. Zhenya had told her many things about the tree, but she had never seen it with her own eyes. This was the first time she felt so strongly about it. Yes, it's always been in his courtyard. He likes to sit on the wooden rocking chair under this tree and look at the sky. The tree reminded Silan of the past. Yes, it's always been in his courtyard. He likes to sit on the wooden rocking chair under this tree and look at the sky. The tree reminded Silan of the past. However, those people might not be able to reappear in the future. Engenia wanted to stay here for a while longer. As for what Silan had told her about Ernest, Engenia told Zhen Xingfu to take Silan to find him. Zhen Xingfu asked Silan a lot of excited questions about his grandfather Zhenya while they were on their way to find him. Silan told him some of the things he knew, but he chose to keep the most important things to himself. It might not necessarily be a good thing to reveal them now. Zhen Xingji wrinkled his nose at Silan's tight-lipped behavior. Is he really that mysterious? Even Grandma and Aunt Prisa couldn't find out what kind of person Grandpa was, even though he had never met him before. Zhen Xingji's frustration was directly manifested in the way he and Huimao were making faces and sticking out their tongues at each other on Silan's shoulder. This was the first time Zhen Xingji had seen a cat with such rich expressions and a mouth full of lies. Ernest had been researching the secret of Zhen Xingfu and the others' bodies changing overnight. He hurriedly came out to greet them when he was informed that someone had come to visit. Since Engenia had greeted him earlier, Ernest didn't dare to be too slow. He wanted to get more information out of Zhen Xingfu. However, Silan suggested a private conversation with Ernest and emphasized that he had a heart-to-heart talk with Ran earlier. Ernest's heart skipped a beat when he heard this. He felt worried for no reason. As expected, Silan told him about the nightmare taper not long after they entered the meeting room. After Rand's introduction, Silan also knew where to start and how to communicate with the people who had participated in the taper eradication operation. A long period of silence later, Ernest stood up and left. He returned with a storage device in his hand. Everything I know about the nightmare taper is in here. Ernest had tried to find other ways to solve the problem for many years, but he never made any progress. In the end, he put it aside. Silan accepted the storage device and said, "Thank you. This is all I can do. I hope you can find a way to solve the problem. I'll try my best." While Zhen Xingfu and Zhen Xingji were waiting outside, Prisa came over as well. "Where's Silan?" Prisa asked curiously. Zhen Xingji curled his lips at the meeting room's direction and said, "He's having a private conversation." The meeting room door opened just after Zhen Xingji finished speaking. Silan and Onista walked out of the meeting room one after another. Onista had already adjusted his mental state, and the smile on his face had returned. He saluted Prisa when he saw her. Prisa's gaze landed on Silan. She knew Silan better than anyone else, and she knew what Silan was capable of. She knew some of the more secretive things Silan had done in the past, including the time he destroyed Miracle's key research base at Sector C. What was it that required such a long private conversation? Prisa was curious. "I know about you, Silan. My little nephew often mentions you," Prisa said. Although Zhen Xingfu called Prisa his aunt, Silan had a feeling that the little nephew Prisa mentioned wasn't Zhen Xingfu, but someone else. Chapter 402. In the past, Prisa was a mystery to everyone. In the past, everyone thought that she was a lone hunter who didn't belong to any force. Although she wasn't as lone as Osculos, she did come from a relatively clean background compared to the others. However, it was gradually revealed that Prisa had a close relationship with one of the three titans of Sector S, Golden Beginning. That being said, the information wasn't necessarily true or complete. Just like how Prissa referred to him as her little nephew now. Zhen Xingfu must have mentioned Silan before, but Prissa's tone made Silan feel like she was talking about someone else. However, Prissa wasn't here for Silan. After Zhen Xingfu and Zhen Xingji left with Silan, Prissa asked Onista about it. Onista didn't tell her the specifics. He only mentioned the key points. The nightmare taper. Prissa frowned. She was annoyed by the term as of late. The military was slowly coming to an end, and some of the people who supported Miracle had changed their stance. After Orlas's death, the support behind Miracle had begun to decrease drastically, and the situation was even more obvious now that the 8 corps were fighting against each other openly and covertly. Prissa sighed. Why would he want to come into contact with that? In Prissa's opinion, it wasn't something a hunter like Silan should pay attention to. If he were to get involved in something like this, he would only be at a disadvantage. In fact, he might even get himself killed in the end. There was no absolute right or wrong when it came to Miracle. It was possible that something you thought was right would end tragically, just like what happened to Si Fang back in the day. Back then, there were some people who were imprisoned in the highest prison, and the so-called heinous crimes they committed were nothing more than a label they were forced to put on them after the fact. It was because Prissa understood the importance of this issue, the general trend of the world, and how important Silan was to Engenia, Zhensheng, and the others. That was why she thought so highly of this issue. After thinking for a while, Prissa hurried back to the courtyard to talk to Engenia, who was still deep in thought. That night, Engenia went to talk to Silan. As a senior, Engenia treated Silan as her own grandson. In fact, she valued him even more than Zhen Xingfu and Zhen Xingji. After Prissa told her about Silan's situation, Engenia thought about it for a while and came to talk to Silan alone after dinner. She didn't object directly. She wanted to hear Silan's opinion. Genya definitely wouldn't have brought someone with him who was stupid or blind. You know, Master isn't a member of the League of Stars. He's from another galaxy, Silan said as he looked at Engenia, who was waiting for his explanation. Engenia knew some of Genya's secrets, but she wasn't very clear about them. She knew what Silan was talking about, but she didn't say anything and listened to Silan's explanation. I can go there, but the number of people who can pass is limited. The technology is still in development, and it isn't mature yet. This is why Master hasn't come to see you yet. Queen Engenia was able to deduce a lot of things from the fact that Silan had brought Golden Beginning to where he was today. He is still the same as before. He doesn't want to drag us down at all. Engenia sighed. In the current situation, Genya's appearance would definitely make him a target. If Genya's forces were weak, then even if Engenia, Zhensheng, and the others didn't mind, Genya wouldn't do something like this. Silan shot Engenia a glance before continuing. Azrael's people, Ji Feng's people, and maybe even more people know that I possess this technology. If a full-blown disaster breaks out, Ji Feng and Azrael's people will definitely force me to open the passage to the other side. If that happens, it won't be a good thing for both Mist Bodhisattva and the League of Stars. On the other hand, I can't just run away with my people. The fact that Wuxia managed to contact Silan so quickly and divulge some information from time to time meant that it wasn't just about Huimao. Silan had a feeling that Wuxia knew that he possessed the technology as well. If a full-blown disaster broke out, Wuxia would definitely leave with his people, and the way to leave lay in Silan's hands. Otherwise, why would Wuxia suddenly express goodwill at a time of chaos like this after holding back and observing for so many years? Moreover, if a full-blown disaster broke out, Silan could escape with only the 11th squad, but most of the 11th squad's people were still here. Engenia's group, Mo Heng's group, Lung's group, and so on were still here. How were they supposed to leave with their roots here? How were they supposed to leave on their own? Once a person ran away once, they would run away a second and a third time. The first time they ran away would leave the deepest scar in their hearts. When they thought back on it later, they would realize that they had abandoned their homes, abandoned their former comrades, and abandoned their people. It was a betrayal. There was nothing a hunter hated more than betrayal. There was no such thing as absolute obedience to a hunter's orders. It was more about following one's heart. Sure Tang's research was nearing its end, but if he couldn't keep up with the research, there was no way he could send everyone away before the disaster broke out. Because of Chip, the last of the 5 brothers, you had started divulging some of the key technologies to Sure Tang. They were hoping to perfect the technology as soon as possible. Sillin told Angenia a lot of things. He didn't tell her part of the reason, but he just wanted to show her his determination. After listening to Sillin's explanation, Angenia knew that Sillin's explanation wasn't complete, but she didn't probe further. She knew that Sillin had made up his mind, so she didn't try to persuade him. Instead, she said, Miracle's research bases are all over the League of Stars. Some of them are known by the military, and some of them are hidden. According to Onista, those people are really crazy. That was just the beginning. Onista and the others thought that they had destroyed all the information about the Nightmare Taper, but they didn't expect that there were still backups. There were even some intact samples. Where are they hidden? Si Fang, who had planned everything meticulously, couldn't find them. Therefore, even if a few divisions of the military worked together, they might not be able to eliminate all the threats. Therefore, the entire League of Stars will face the same disaster almost at the same time. It won't be just one place. Who can avoid it? Sillin crossed his arms on his knees and said, if such a disaster really happens, I'll get them to open the tunnel first and send you guys over. No, Angenia rejected immediately. You said that the technology isn't comprehensive, and there's a limit to the number of people we can send. There are so many people in Golden Beginning, and they call me Queen. I have to live up to that title. What about Zhen Xingfu, and the rest? They won't leave either. Angenia smiled. I know them. Sillin paused and asked, how long do we have? Prisa said that some of the important management members of Miracle committed suicide not long after they were captured. When they committed suicide, they were all laughing maniacally. As for the exact time, the military can't say for sure. After all, the targets were those crazy people from Miracle. I heard that the person controlling those things hasn't been found yet. The Miracle people left some samples back then. However, there was only one success when they conducted the Nightmare Tapers experiment again. That was the only female Nightmare Taper that succeeded. I believe Onista has told you how to deal with the Nightmare Taper. The things released as virus carriers will listen to the orders of the Nightmare Taper. However, the main body has yet to be found by the military's legions. Prisa had told Angenia all of this. Angenia was telling Sillin this because she wanted to tell Sillin that there was no way he could help even if he wanted to. It was unnecessary. Finding the Nightmare Taper was the only way. There were so many people in the military, political organizations, and big families looking for it. How much could Sillin do with his little manpower? It's fine. Sillin smiled. I'll stay here with you guys. I don't dare to meet Master alone. Sillin contacted Yudi after talking to Angenia. Ji Feng was going to clean up the hunter regiments again and collect resources on a large scale. Moreover, they would avoid some of the more prosperous star zones once the war started. That way, they would be able to avoid the impending disaster. Sillin told Yudi and the 11th Squad to join the operation. With Ji Feng's capabilities, he definitely knew some inside information and knew that a great disaster was coming. However, the hunters who traveled through space wouldn't suffer as much of a blow as the others. They could choose to avoid the disaster zone. Sillin even contacted you alone. Help Sure Tang and speed up the research. We don't have much time left. If anything happens, take everyone away from the League of Stars and return to Mist Bodhisattva. A moment of silence later, Moon answered, all right. This time, his answer was very formal. What about you? Moon asked again. Don't worry about us. Wheeze, Cheto, and I will be fine. You fell silent again. After the call with Sillin, the 11th Squad's equipment malfunctioned for the second time. It was because Moon was overthinking again. Early the next morning, Prisa came to Silen's resting place to wait for him. "Silen, my little nephew wants to talk to you," Prisa said with a helpless look on her face. Prisa led Silen to a secret room. Silen knew just how confidential their conversation was going to be when he saw the setup of the equipment inside. Who on earth was acting so secretive? What Silen didn't expect was that Prisa left on her own after she brought Silen inside, leaving Silen alone. A moment later, a light screen popped up. The person on the screen was very familiar to Silen. "Long time no see, Silen." Silen stared at the person on the screen and smiled. "I didn't think that the little nephew Prisa mentioned would be you. Long time no see, C.I. Jincheng." On the screen, C.I. Jincheng spread his hands. "The matters of the elders are too complicated to be explained clearly. If I were to sum it up in one sentence, it would be, the fucking love between a prisoner of the highest level prison and a local." Silen couldn't help but laugh. Just what kind of blow did C.I. Jincheng suffer for him to swear? What's wrong? Is there something urgent that requires a star rank hunter to act as a messenger? Silen asked. "I heard that you're going to participate in the Nightmare Tapers matter." "I'm just taking a look. I'm alone after all, so I'll try my best to help out when the time comes. It'll count as me doing my part," Silen said. C.I. Jincheng was silent for a moment before asking, "Are you sure?" "Yes." "All right then. Come and help me." On the screen, C.I. Jincheng smiled. "I'm going to form a special team to deal with the Nightmare Taper." "The military should have such a special team, right?" "Yes, but I want to form one myself. I don't have much say in that team, and I don't agree with the person in charge." C.I. Jincheng didn't finish his sentence. Other than these reasons, the C.I. family was also interfering. Those special teams were going to enter the disaster area, and the C.I. family was reluctant to let C.I. Jincheng go. However, it was obvious that C.I. Jincheng was a stubborn and uncontrollable person. After Prisa told him that Silen was interested in interfering with the Nightmare Taper, C.I. Jincheng hastily came up with a plan. It was a plan for the Taper Extermination project team that he had formed himself. "Who else is in your team?" Silen asked. C.I. Jincheng blinked. "Everyone in our dorm was here before. Some people will join us too, such as Yu Lu, Kong Man, Pride, Alan." Listening to the familiar names that he hadn't seen for a long time, Silen said, "All right, I'll join you. But will the G family agree to Pride?" "Pride will take care of it himself. He already promised that." "I'll bring someone and a cat over. Cheto and Wheeze, right?" "I know. Come with my aunt when the time comes." "I've already told her." "To your side." "Emen, I have an experimental base on an asteroid here." "All right, we'll contact each other when we get there." On the second day after they arrived at Golden Beginnings headquarters, Silen left with Prisa. Silen and Prisa left separately and met up somewhere outside of Sector S. No one, including Zhen Xingfu, knew that Prisa would leave with Silen in secret. This time, Prisa, who usually brought Zhen Xingji with her, excused herself and left on her own. Zhen Xingji was depressed for a long time because of this. "Silen, are we going to do something big this time?" Lying on Silen's shoulder, Hui Mao said weakly and emphasized the word, big. "Yes, something big." "Nonsense. I heard everything you said." Hui Mao played with his front paws and pulled at his ears. He complained, "Why don't we leave and leave this place alone?" "No. You humans are so complicated." Hui Mao sighed. "I'm fine. You know I'm immune to those things." Silen scratched Hui Mao's chin. After going through the zebra virus, Silen had developed a resistance to many deadly viruses. Hui Mao knew this. Silen was more knowledgeable in this field, and so was the gray cat. However, how could he do something as stupid as doing something big without leaving his name? Even if he couldn't make a name for himself, he should at least be rewarded with a huge sum of money. This time, he didn't get anything, and he still had to sneak around. It was nowhere near as sensational as it was back in the Mist Bodhisattva sect. Although it was only a small incident, it had benefited Weiss a lot since then. The successful establishment of the forum especially allowed Weiss to satisfy its celebrity addiction. Huimao scratched Silen's clothes with his claws. He wasn't happy to work for free. The life and death of other people had nothing to do with him. He wouldn't feel anything even if the entire League of Stars, including the hunting planet where he was born, were destroyed. It's because it can avoid some trouble in the future. Silen said. Huimao didn't understand what Silen meant, and he couldn't be bothered to think about it either. After licking his claws, he curled into a ball and fell asleep on Silen's legs. Prisa's spaceplane didn't have any special markings, but it was unimpeded after entering Sector C. Her flight path was special. It was obvious that she had prepared for this long ago. Silen was surprised that Prisa was related to the CI family by blood. It was no wonder that Prisa was able to become a star rank hunter. Other than her own abilities, her connections were also very strong. The planet CI Jincheng mentioned was at the edge of Sector C, and close to Sector B. Following the chaos of the League of Stars, some of the famous schools in Sector B had become much quieter. They were far less lively than before. In this chaos in the Star Alliance, many forces had fallen from power. Many students, who had gone from experts to experts, could not even afford to pay their school fees. There were also some people who were protected by their families due to political reasons and did not return to school. As for the teachers in the school, some of the more experienced ones like Mo Hung had been snatched away by various parties. Those with important achievements in engineering, medicine, materials and so on were all busy accepting commissions. Where would they find the time to take care of students? It had been a long time since Silen had been to Seven Lights. While he was thinking, Prisa told Silen that they were almost there. The image of a planet was already displayed on the screen. This planet wasn't a habitable planet. Its habitability didn't even reach rank C. The planet was covered in protective shields, and almost all of the protective shields were enclosed bases. From the outside, the planet looked very attractive. However, when Silen and the others reached the planet and landed in the base, they were greeted by a different scene. An artificial steady-state environment? Silen looked at the interior of the base and sighed. The inside of the base was like an independent little world. There were forests, streams, and 4 seasons of the year. The air was pleasant. These were all man-made, and many of them were the application of new technology. Huimao started rolling on the grass after entering the base, rubbing and sniffing here and there. He habitually marked the places he was satisfied with. I've been waiting for you for a long time, Silen. A person walked over from not far away and said. The person was not CI Jincheng, but Silen's classmate from 7 Lights years ago. Long time no see, Kong Man. Chapter 403. Back then, Kong Man was still an arrogant and stubborn young man. He and Pride were known as the twin stars of 7 Lights. A few years had passed, and Kong Man's arrogance had lessened a lot. Perhaps it was because he had gone through a lot of things and learned to hide his emotions. However, Kong Man was still very happy when he saw Silen. CI Jincheng had told him beforehand that Silen would be joining them. Although Silen was no longer the same as before, it did not affect Kong Man's opinion of Silen. This was especially true when he learned that Silen's shadow was behind the miracle at a certain base at Sector C. Kong Man truly admired him. Silen introduced Chedo and Huimao to Kong Man. Huimao glanced lazily at Kong Man and continued to mark the territory. Kong Man did not know how many people this newly formed Taper Extermination team had, or who they were. He only knew a part of them. Lung wasn't here. CI Jincheng told Silen that according to young Master Lung, they were working together from the inside and outside. Young Master Lung would investigate from the outside and then report back to the squad. After all, the military and civilian might not receive the same information, and young Master Lung had many unorthodox methods, so he would be able to obtain a lot more information. Kang Man led Sillin into the interior of the base. The research area was a little far from here, and there were some training grounds in between. When Sillin followed Kang Man past there, he just so happened to run into a couple of people coming out. When they saw Sillin, they were stunned for a moment. Then, the person walking at the front quickly rushed over and grabbed Sillin's neck, shouting, "You've finally appeared." Sillin elbowed him with a backhand. "If you used any more strength, my neck would have been broken." "Then you deserve it." Although he said that, Knight still loosened his arm. However, he still punched Sillin a couple of times. "You're so mysterious that you always disappear." "Can't help it. I'm a hunter." Sillin rubbed his shoulder. "Knight really did use some strength." "Bullshit. I've never seen anyone like you, Huntress. You're just like fog and wuxia. You'll disappear after a while and come out again after a while." The few people standing at the entrance of the training room smiled as they looked over. Among them were Yu Lu and Feng Haichao, whom Sillin was familiar with. However, the way they looked at Sillin was a little strange. They kept thinking about Miracle's base. This was especially true for Yu Lu. He had seen Cheto's face before, but his heart skipped a beat when he saw Cheto's face. He suddenly recalled the strange man who had fought Stola to a standstill inside Miracle's base. Was it really him? So strong? Since when did Sillin have such an expert by his side? "Yo, are you done with your training, boys?" Prissa, who was walking behind them, said. "You're back." Knight raised his hand in greeting. "I was wondering when my presence was so low that people could ignore me," Prissa said. "Not at all, not at all." Knight and the others shook their heads in unison. They still needed the help of an expert like Prissa during their upcoming training, or they wouldn't make much progress if they trained alone. It was obvious that Prissa's guidance would be more effective. In fact, Prissa's main reason for coming here was to accept C.I. Jinchang's invitation and help train these youngsters. These people might be the elites of the military, but they were far from reaching Prissa's standards. They were going to face Miracle, a famous bionic warrior from Monster Corporation. Since they had joined the Taper extermination team, it was only natural that Prissa had high expectations for their strength. The gray cat crouched on Sillin's shoulder and stared at these people. It recognized Yu Lu, and it had met him a couple of times already. It knew that this person was present back at Miracle's base, but Sillin had told it to ignore him, so it didn't act. He didn't think that he would become a teammate of the Taper extermination team. But this kid's strength, feeling Hui Mao's gaze, Yu Lu looked over. He himself was wondering why Sillin's pet would look at him with such a disdainful gaze. They had seen Hui Mao when they were on missions in the past, and knew that this cat was special. But this gaze was really irritating. "You're Whis, right? Do you have something against me?" Yu Lu walked over and looked at the fat cat crouching on Sillin's shoulder as he asked. Hui Mao flicked his ears and turned his head away. "You're too weak." Everyone around him stared at him. Too weak. Yu Lu was considered the cream of the crop among the young men in the army. However, this was the first time that Yu Lu had received such an evaluation. Moreover, the one who evaluated him was a cat with a gaze full of disdain. Prissa couldn't help but laugh. This is the first time Yu Lu has heard such an evaluation. "Whis, you're too much of a blow." "No, I don't lie," Hui Mao said righteously. Knight and the others continued to stare at him. This statement was even more of a blow. Yu Lu's face twitched a couple of times. He didn't know what to say. Before Prissa could continue, Hui Mao pointed a paw at Cheto and said, "Cheto can beat them with one hand." This time, everyone except Yu Lu and Knight broke their silence. They were about as strong as Yu Lu, and although Hui Mao was talking about Yu Lu, it felt like he had dragged them into the conversation as well. Right now, Yu Lu was even more certain that Cheto was that person from the Miracle base. Knight continued to remain silent because Lung had told him about Cheto before. He hadn't personally witnessed how powerful Cheto was, but according to Lung, there was no way he could measure the strength of a non-human. He was a monster just like Silen. Who would know that the man in front of them was actually a robot? Moreover, only idiots would fight a strange robot head-on. Alright. You guys have rested enough, haven't you? Then get back to training. I'll check your progress. Prisa pushed them back to the training field. Yulu glanced at Silen and Cheto before following her inside. Silen, I'm going to train for a while. I'll come find you and Ci Jincheng when I'm done. While saying this, Knight also turned around and walked into the training field. Before he turned around, he swiftly flicked Huimao's ear as if he was taking revenge. Huimao bared his teeth. If these people weren't his teammates, he would have stretched out his claws a long time ago. Kong Man was only interested in Silen's research abilities. He didn't know much about the other's strength, but from their conversation, he could feel that the current Silen had changed greatly compared to when he was at Seven Lights. If Silen's men were this strong, then Silen couldn't be bad either. But envy was one thing, but Kong Man knew his own position very well. He also knew that he didn't have much to contribute in terms of combat ability, so it was better to work on the direction he was interested in. While Kong Man was looking for Ci Jincheng with Silen, inside the training room. Only a few people had gone out earlier, and there were still a few people inside. When Feng Haichao and the others returned and told them what happened just now, the people inside the training room immediately exploded. However, because Prisa was here, everyone endured it. They were all elites of this generation. Who could remain calm after hearing such extremely disdainful words? Do you know Cheto's strength? Prisa asked while looking at the people inside the room. No one answered. The discussion became much quieter, and some people even murmured in a low voice. Knight, Yulu, you should have heard some things about Cheto. What do you think? Prisa asked again. It was only now Feng Haichao remembered that neither Yulu nor Knight had said anything just now. At first, he thought that Knight was silent because of Silen, but it didn't look like that was the case. I heard that he's very strong, Knight said seriously. Heard? Ruolin frowned. Ruolin frowned and wasn't satisfied with Knight's words. The others weren't satisfied with Knight's hearsay either. Was there no truth to it? Yulu was about to tell them about the scene he saw at the Miracle base when Prisa spoke first. Then I'll tell you something I've heard. Although I haven't seen it with my own eyes, the person who told me this wouldn't lie. Everyone fell completely silent and listened to Prisa's next words. Among the 6 stars of Hunt, Prisa was the only person who didn't look like a star hunter. She wasn't high and mighty, and she was easy to get along with. If one didn't know that she was one of the 6 stars of Hunt, no one would associate her with the 6 stars of Hunt. Although the military worshipped Heaven's edict more than the hunters, the people here didn't share the same opinion. Maybe it was because Prisa was Ci Jincheng's aunt and a trustworthy person that they respected her more. Or maybe it was because they were too disappointed in some of the people in the military that their worship had shifted. Under everyone's gaze, Prisa continued, you all know the 2 famous assassin organizations in the League of Stars, Mist, and Wuxia. Then let me use the people from Mist as a comparison. A while ago, an old friend told me that Mist lost 3 people. Among the 3, Swift Blade Tires died by Cheto's hand, and Cheto was unharmed. Silence. A long silence. Even if they hadn't fought Swift Blade Tires directly, they still knew a little about his strength. A person who could kill Swift Blade Tires and come out unscathed. Then, what about the other 2 of the 3? Ruolin asked with difficulty. Prisa looked at him, isn't there still Silen? A collective gasp sounded. The corner of Knight's mouth twitched again and again. He cursed in his mind, that bastard Lung, why didn't he tell me about Silen? Since when did Silen become so strong? Motherfucker. After Prisa was done, she looked at the equipment at the side of the training room and smiled. At this moment, Huimao, who was lying on Silen's shoulder and grinning cheekily, suddenly froze. Then, he cried out, "Meow, that woman discovered me." Sillin knocked on Huemao's head. "That's what you get for eavesdropping on us so blatantly." Huemao's ears turned and said stubbornly, "I was careless. If I had gotten serious, that woman might not have been able to discover me." Walking at the front, Kong Man thought about the conversation between Sillin and Huimao in confusion. Why didn't he understand what they were talking about? When they arrived at the research area, C.I. Jincheng was alone. A rare smile appeared on his face when he saw Sillin. "You're here." Sillin looked at the equipment around him. "Very good stuff." As expected of the CI family, the equipment they used was of the best quality. Even Huimao, who was a little picky after seeing the equipment Shimu and the others used, did not have a cheap mouth for once. "How is it?" Sillin asked as he looked at the data and molecular models on the screen. C.I. Jincheng rubbed his forehead. He looked a little tired. It had been days since he had rested well. "The samples are incomplete, so it's very difficult to study further." While saying this, C.I. Jincheng operated on the screen for a bit and pointed at some of the information displayed on the screen. He said, "They're all incomplete samples, and the preservation of the samples isn't good either. The information we can obtain from them is too limited, and the accuracy is far from what I want. We spent a lot of effort to obtain these samples, and the other research teams aren't any better than me." Sillin could understand C.I. Jincheng's troubles. Without good samples, it was very difficult to make any progress. They might not be able to obtain the results they wanted even if they continued researching day and night. Back then, Si Fong was very unyielding when he carried out the tapir extermination operation. None of his subordinates kept any nightmare tapir samples. All the nightmare tapir samples that they knew and saw were destroyed. That was why they couldn't find a perfectly preserved nightmare tapir sample in the army now. The samples that C.I. Jincheng had, and the samples that the other research teams had, were all collected during the past few years of encirclement and suppression of Miracle. Even splicing the information won't work? Sillin asked. No, those samples are all different. The viruses they carry and their tolerance are all different. Without knowing the parent, splicing the information will make the error even bigger. C.I. Jincheng picked up the cup next to him and gulped down a few mouthfuls of water. He was really exhausted during this period of time, but the results he obtained were really annoying. Is there any progress on Lung's side? Sillin asked. C.I. Jincheng shook his head. No, I don't think there's much progress. Before he finished, C.I. Jincheng received an emergency communication request. His communication here had gone through multiple layers of encryption and camouflage. Its confidentiality was very high, and it was very difficult for others to eavesdrop. Looking at the code on the communicator, C.I. Jincheng raised his eyebrows. I just mentioned this guy and he's calling. C.I. Jincheng pressed the button to accept the call directly, and the light screen that popped up showed young Master Lung's usual slovenly appearance. The moment the call connected, young Master Lung made a fuss. Has Sillin gone to your side yet? I have an emergency. C.I. Jincheng looked at the person on the light screen who was yelling, I have an emergency, while swinging his feet and chewing on a watermelon. He silently adjusted his perspective so that Sillin was facing the light screen. Pfft! Lung was so excited that he spat out a mouthful of watermelon water. Quite a bit of it even went into his nose. Fuck! Why didn't you guys tell me that Sillin is here? What's the emergency? Sillin did not waste words with him. There was no telling where this guy would go once he started talking. The young master wiped his mouth with his sleeve and threw away the watermelon skin carelessly. Lung said, I found some information regarding the sample that C.I. Jincheng mentioned. C.I. Jincheng was going to sit down at the side, but he immediately stopped when he heard Lung's words. He walked up and asked, You got it? I got it. But I get angry when I talk about it. Lung said angrily, that red-eyed one is seriously hard to please. I can't get a single fart out of him no matter how much I try. Ever since young Master Lung locked the little old man Brzett outside the study, he had become a lot more at ease. The red-eyed one? Sillin was puzzled. That thug from Sector V. Oh, Blood-Eye Aiken. Sillin nodded. What does this have to do with him? This doesn't have much to do with him at first, but it does have something to do with his foster father. Lung explained. The foster father of the current leader of the Freedom Army, Aiken thus, used to be one of the bigwigs of Sector V. However, after the bigwigs were killed one after another and Sector V fell into complete chaos, Aiken thus, as one of the man's many foster sons, seized the opportunity to rise to power. There are many reasons why the bigwigs of Sector V were killed one after another. One of them is that some of them are connected to miracles, and Aikenthus' foster father is one of them. Also, he is one of the people who helped to preserve the sample. Lung's words were the most important piece of information. C.I. Jincheng could not help but grow excited. He was not afraid of not being able to get his hands on the sample. No matter how difficult it was, he had to find a way to get his hands on the sample. Otherwise, everything would be too late. No wonder it was so hard to clean up the sample back then. He didn't think that they would infiltrate Sector V. How laughable. Sector V almost became the Nightmare Taper's sacrifice, but in the end, they were the ones who helped to preserve these killing machines that almost took their lives. On the other hand, the reason why Si Fang couldn't find the remaining samples back then was definitely because of Osculos's interference. Otherwise, the people of Sector V might not have been able to keep the sample a secret with Si Fang's determination and methods back then. Lung continued to talk about the investigation this time. Through the unorthodox methods in his hands that could not see the light of day, he did manage to find a lot of useful information. Then, he dug deeper into the information and dug out Aiken thus. The samples that were preserved back then were all taken back by the miracles after the bigwigs of Sector V were killed one after another. However, they might not have really taken everything. Back then, those bigwigs had helped to preserve a box, and the Nightmare Taper's sample was inside the box. However, they did not know that the box contained the thing that those bigwigs had spent a lot of money to preserve. However, one of the bigwigs opened the box by force. Once the box was opened, the item inside would spontaneously destroy itself upon contact with oxygen. Fortunately, there was an exception. One of the samples did not undergo oxidation and decomposition when it came into contact with air. At the time, Aikenthus' foster father happened to be there, and after he killed the person, he secretly stored the sample away. He did not tell anyone about the sample even in his death. I'm guessing that miracles didn't expect there to be an unexpected exception. That was why they did not suspect Aikenthus' foster father after they saw the oxidation and decomposition scene. After cleaning up the people who helped to preserve the sample and retrieving the sample, miracles allowed Sector V to do whatever they wanted. So, you suspect that Aiken thus has the sample? Sillin asked. Aiken thus had taken over some of his foster father's things. In other words, he had forcefully seized some of his foster father's things. It was very likely that the Nightmare Taper's sample was among them. That is indeed the case. However, I've talked to Aiken thus many times, but he refused to say anything. He wouldn't say that he has it, but he wouldn't say that he doesn't. I think that you have a good relationship with him. If you personally ask him about it, he might speak up. Lung's great young master was pretty depressed. The great Andryara family's current young master had lowered himself to talk to him in person, and Aiken thus still gave him the cold shoulder. Chapter 404. The conversation between Aikenthus and young Master Lung wasn't as difficult to pry as young Master Lung had claimed. In fact, the conversation was quite pleasant when it came to business and the cooperation between the Andryara family and the Freedom Army. But the moment the topic of miracle was brought up, the atmosphere turned cold. Aikenthus kept his mouth shut. He refused to speak no matter what benefits Lung promised him. However, when young Master Lung pulled Sillin's strings, Aikenthus reacted. Aikenthus, the man who didn't even bat an eyelid when the Food King was mentioned, had spoken up when Lung mentioned Sillin. It was why Lung had contacted C.I. Jincheng in a hurry. The 11th Squad didn't have Sillin's men at all, and Sector C's communication signal was special. Lung didn't dare to contact CI Jincheng carelessly unless there were special anti-eavesdropping devices like CI Jincheng's base. Alright, I'll ask him later. But I can't guarantee that I'll be able to obtain information about the nightmare taper from him. Sillin emphasized the possibility first so that he wouldn't look forward to it in vain. I think, Lung rubbed his chin, that guy must know some secrets even if he doesn't have a sample of the nightmare taper. After ending the call with Lung, Sillin used CI Jincheng's communicator to contact Achenthus. Since Lung had informed Achenthus early in the morning, the call connected very quickly when Sillin tried to contact him. You guys really want that? Achenthus cut to the chase. He could guess a lot of things from his conversation with Lung. Yeah, we have to give it a try no matter what. Sillin answered. If it really does erupt, how many people do you think will survive? I can't say for sure. It'll be a disaster if it erupts. No one could avoid this disaster, not even Sector V. I do have that. I hope that you can help us as soon as possible when you find a solution, and not wait until the last moment to consider the people of Sector V. Since he owed Sillin a couple of favors, Aiken thus was a little tactful when he said this, which was rare for him. If the person he was negotiating with was Lung, then Achenthus would definitely take a strong stance. Of course. It was already great news that Aiken thus had a sample. Plus, there was no way Sillin would leave the Freedom Army alone. Right now, the Freedom Army was faintly showing signs of becoming the leader of Sector V. Aiken thus would not let go of such a great situation unless it was absolutely necessary. For Sillin, this was a good thing. Aiken thus didn't trust anyone else, so he insisted on going to the Freedom Army to get a sample. At first, Sillin was going to go there himself, but after some thought, he decided to send Cheto instead. Apart from Sillin, Cheto was the person who left the deepest impression on Achenthus. Moreover, Cheto was Sillin's most trusted subordinate. Therefore, Achenthus agreed to the arrangement after a moment of thought. Oh right, there's one more thing I want to tell you. The first time we met you, we were being chased, and the ones who were chasing us were the 6th Legion. The poison in Qing's body was produced by miracle. When I was fleeing, I saw a person. That person was with the 6th Division at the time, and a long time ago, I saw him and my adoptive father talking. He was the one who gave the box to my adoptive father. He might be the one who took the box. Aiken thus didn't say everything. He wasn't completely telling the truth. The one who recognized that person wasn't Aiken thus himself, but Anna Qing. At the time, Aiken thus didn't have the opportunity to come into close contact with those things, nor did he have the ability to do so. However, Qing could. Qing's concealment ability was pretty strong. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to act as Qing to this extent without being recognized. Sillin knew that there was more to this than meets the eye, but judging from Akenthus's expression, he knew that the man wasn't going to tell the truth. Therefore, he didn't pursue the matter further. Do you have an image of that person? Sillin asked. No, but I do have his drawing. Aiken thus brought up a scanned image of a drawing. It's him. Maybe you can learn something from him. After memorizing the person's appearance on the image, Sillin said his thanks and ended the call after discussing with Aiken thus about the sample. Inside CI Jincheng's workshop, Sillin, Cheto, CI Jincheng, and the Lung in the image were discussing about the sample collection. After Cheto had gone over, Longhui arranged for someone to receive him and secretly send him to Sector V. Once there, Aiken thus would take over. There was no way he would allow the Andryra family to infiltrate deep into the Freedom Army. While Sillin and the others were discussing, the bored Huimao had gone to the indoor forest to play. The environment inside the forest was very good, comparable to the natural environment of some rank A planets. Moreover, the species inside the forest had been carefully calculated and maintained in a relatively stable state. There was no way that an accident to a certain species would cause a break in this small food chain. At the training room, the floor was littered with people. Prisa was the only one standing in the entire training room. Right now, Prisa was not looking at the people lying on the ground. Instead, she was standing with her back to them and watching the image that popped up from a device in her hand. Knight rubbed his almost dislocated arm, climbed up and staggered over. "What are you looking at, Senior?" Knight asked. In the past, Prisa would explain everything to them after training with them. But today, she did not say anything and went to the side to do her own thing. "That's right. What are you looking at, Senior?" Ruolin asked while rolling on the floor. They all addressed Prisa as Senior. It was a common form of address used by hunters, so they addressed her as such. They couldn't possibly call her Auntie like Ci Jincheng, could they? "You guys want to see?" Prisa turned around and looked at the group of people lying on the floor. "Yes." Everyone answered in unison. When Knight walked over, Prisa had covered the device so she did not see it. Now that he heard Prisa's words, Knight immediately retreated and sat on the floor with Yu Lu and the others, waiting for Prisa's next move. Prisa opened the button-sized device in her palm, and an image popped up on the light screen. It was the ecological zone inside this base. At this moment, the field of view displayed on the light screen was a dense forest, all kinds of trees and shrubs, and artificial light was shining on this area like natural light. Some small insects were active, and a few butterflies were dancing among the flowers. Everyone looked at the scene on the screen in confusion, so they looked at Prisa in confusion. Prisa pointed a finger at one of the corners, and the image zoomed in. The group of people stared at the image with wide eyes. They waited, but there was nothing. They waited again, but there was nothing. Just as Knight was about to speak, a shadow suddenly flashed across the image. It was so fast that it was hard to catch. If everyone wasn't staring at the image closely, they might not have noticed it. "That's..." The corner of Knight's eye twitched, "that fat cat." On the image, Huimao flashed quickly like a ghost. One moment it was next to a parasol tree, the next it was crouching behind a shrub. When everyone saw this, they all had the same thought in their minds: how did it do that with its size? Huimao was crouching, the pupils of its round eyes dilated as it stared in a certain direction. The movement of its paw was so quiet that even the people next to it might not be able to hear it. Huimao's ears turned, and then turned to look in a certain direction. There were some hidden surveillance devices there, and the image Prisa released was taken by one of them. "What a vigilant little guy." Prisa smiled. "Senior, you mean it noticed us looking at it?" Knight asked. "Yes." On the image, Huimao looked in their direction, the corners of his mouth curled up, and then returned to its previous state, moving stealthily in the direction of its destination. "I can't help but feel that there's something strange about this cat." Roland scratched his arm and said. "What's that guy doing?" Feng Haichao followed Huimao's line of sight, but saw nothing. Knight and the others thought the same. Their eyes hurt from watching, but they didn't see anything. "Can it not see?" Knight mumbled. As soon as Knight finished speaking, everyone froze at the same time, thinking of a certain guy. "It can't be." In the next moment, Huimao pounced towards a branch on a large tree like lightning. Then, a sharp scream rang. "It really is that guy. Hurry up and call Ci Jincheng, or else his long-eared owl is going to end up in the cat's stomach." Ci Jincheng had a pet, a long-eared owl. This guy was usually the leader of this ecological zone, and often showed off its feathers that were different from normal long-eared owls. It also had a cheap mouth, and sometimes Yu Lu wanted nothing more than to take a gun and give it an unforgettable lesson. Not only could this long-eared owl speak, it was also very intelligent. After all, it was trained by Ci Jincheng, so it had mastered many of its skills very well. It had once used Ci Jincheng's microcomputer to hack a section of an electronic magazine. Other than that, it could also turn invisible. Normally, it would use its invisible state when resting in a tree, and it would be very difficult to discover this guy without some special equipment. In the past, this long-eared owl had played many pranks on people. But now, this always cocky guy was being slapped from the air by Cat Claw after Cat Claw, rolling a few times on the grass. When it finally managed to fly up again, it would be slapped down again. Hui Mao was stretching its gray wings and playfully slapping this long-eared owl until it cried out loudly. When it cried out, it even scolded Hui Mao in a few sector languages. Every time it scolded Hui Mao, it would slap him a little harder. In the end, one of the two ear tufts on this long-eared owl's head that it was so proud of was almost chewed off. It looked like it was missing a piece. When C.I. Jincheng rushed over, the scene he saw was his pet being pressed to the ground by the fat cat, howling and scolding loudly. "If you keep scolding me, I'll pluck one of your feathers for every word you say. Do you think I don't understand sector languages?" Hui Mao pressed that long-eared owl down with its claws and wagged its tail. The moment Silin saw Hui Mao like this, he knew that this fat cat was about to get carried away again. He ran over and lifted Hui Mao up. "Didn't I tell you not to bully others?" Silin flicked Hui Mao's ear. Hui Mao moved its claws and shook off the feathers between its claws. "I'm not bullying anyone, I'm bullying a bird." C.I. Jincheng looked at the long-eared owl that was flapping its wings as it ran over and smiled, still showing off. Hearing C.I. Jincheng's words, the long-eared owl cried even louder and vented its grievances with all its might. It even moved its ear tufts to show C.I. Jincheng its pitiful ear feathers. C.I. Jincheng's long-eared owl was called Ghost Claw because it had a pair of extremely sharp claws. However, its claws couldn't do anything to Hui Mao in the clash just now. Even the rescue signal it had sent out had been intercepted. This was also the reason why C.I. Jincheng had only come over after it had been tortured for such a long time. Because all the signals it sent to C.I. Jincheng had been intercepted, it had no choice but to first send a signal to another location before redirecting the distress signal. Prisa didn't let Knight and the others show up, she only informed C.I. Jincheng. After that, they all watched the scene displayed on the screen and saw with their own eyes how that fat cat bullied Ghost Claw. C.I. Jincheng wasn't angry about Ghost Claw's misfortune. Ghost Claw was too proud of himself and needed to be polished a little. Also, that cat had obviously shown mercy with its claws. Otherwise, with Hua's abilities, it would have cut Ghost Claw into pieces with a single swipe of its claws. Inside the training room, the few people laughed and discussed about Ghost Claw. How satisfying. That guy really should be taught a lesson. He often bullied them because they didn't understand some of the native languages of other sectors, so he would change his ways to scold them. This time, he was at a disadvantage. Ha, how satisfying. I've long heard that cats and birds can't get along, but now I've seen it for myself. Feng Haichao said. You're wrong. That cat is establishing its dominance. Prisa put away the instrument in her hand and turned to look at the few people. Establishing its dominance? Oh, I get it. The ecological zone is Ghost Claw's territory, and that cat knows that Ghost Claw is the leader of that territory. That's why it attacked Ghost Claw. That way, it would become the new leader of the ecological zone. A typical battle between beasts. Ruolin felt that he had seen the essence. No, its goal isn't to take over the ecological zone's territory. It attacked Ghost Claw to establish its dominance. Actually, it's establishing its dominance for you to see. Prisa said. Establishing its dominance for us to see. Why? Everyone suddenly remembered the creepy smile that the cat revealed when it looked at the screen just now. On the other side, Hui Mao, who had been dragged back by Silin, was slowly licking his claws. On the table beside him stood Ghost Claw, whose feathers had been plucked quite a bit. Now Ghost Claw was much more well-behaved. He didn't use the languages of other sectors to make a fool of himself, and just stood there pitifully. After C.I. Jincheng combed Ghost Claw's feathers and calmed him down, he had Ghost Claw return to the ecological zone. Although Ghost Claw looked like it was tortured badly, there weren't any wounds. Hui Mao had great control when he swung his claws. Cheto once told him that teaching someone a lesson was a technical job. Hui Mao had learned a bit of a technical job. Cheto had already departed, and C.I. Jincheng would help him leave Sector C in secret. Silin believed that Cheto would be able to handle the rest well. Glar is in the 6th Corps right now. However, there is very little information about him, and we can't get hold of him for now. The only thing we know is that he holds an important position in the 6th Corps. C.I. Jincheng pointed at the image and the few lines of information displayed on the screen and said. Glar was the person Alkenthis mentioned, and after C.I. Jincheng received the appearance from Silan, he couldn't find much information about this person through many channels. This further proved that there was something strange about this person. If he came into contact with Alkenthis' foster father regarding the nightmare taper sample, then I can think of a possibility. C.I. Jincheng said. Spy. Silan also thought of the term. That's right. After Miracle's supporters fell one after another and changed their stance, the legions who supported Miracle in the past are now ruthless as well. They are no less merciful than the others. Right now, the 6th Corps can be considered as a representative of those who are trying to eliminate Miracle. In the past, the 6th Corps and Miracle had a lot of cooperation, but this time, the 6th Corps attacked swiftly and destroyed a few Miracle's bases as soon as the wind changed. There were some things that Silan understood even if C.I. Jincheng didn't say it out loud. The reason why the legions were fighting against each other wasn't necessarily to eliminate a scourge like Miracle. It was more to obtain some precious things from Miracle in advance. For example, the nightmare taper. Glar was probably a spy sent by the 6th Corps' commander, Kakila. This chess piece was buried very early on, which was why Kakila was able to come into contact with the transfer mission of the nightmare taper sample. We can't say for sure if the 6th Corps has successfully activated the main body of the nightmare taper, C.I. Jincheng said. Although the news they received was that none of the 8 legions had managed to activate the main body of the nightmare taper, C.I. Jincheng was still suspicious when he found out about Glar. It was just a suspicion, though. The chances of one of the 8 great marshals, the 6th Corps' commander Kakila possessing the main body of the nightmare taper, was not high. Silan refused to believe that the 6th Legion wasn't the only one who had planted their own pawns inside Miracle. Perhaps these pawns had been exposed by now, or perhaps they hadn't come into contact with that level of secret at all. If that was the case, then all 8 legions were suspects. No. Judging from the current performance of the legions, it didn't look like they had obtained the main body of the nightmare taper. Suspicions aside, they were still prepared to go inside the 6th Corps and take a look. This is the place where Glar often appears. C.I. Jincheng drew a circle on the star map. This was the information he had obtained after using a lot of methods, but it was only this bit of information. It wasn't complete, and they would have to investigate the rest themselves. Can't we filter its nature through the communication network? Silan asked. No, every legion in Sector C has a special protection network. The closer you are to the legion's core area, the greater the restriction. This area is close to the 6th Corps' headquarters, C.I. Jincheng explained. Then we can only go there first and filter. We should be able to know the distribution of the various bases there after we enter. That's the only way. C.I. Jincheng began to investigate all kinds of recent information about the 6th Corps in search of the best way to enter. In the end, C.I. Jincheng chose a route and formulated a plan of action with the others. Prisa wouldn't participate in this operation. After all, her identity was too sensitive, and according to the rules, she couldn't interfere directly. If she was discovered, some people would take the opportunity to cause trouble instead. Chapter 405. On a planet under the jurisdiction of the 6th Legion at Sector C, there were busy soldiers and transport robots everywhere. This planet was a transit planet. Some of the 6th Legion's goods would be transported from this planet to various places. It was because of this planet's nature. What followed was an increasingly strict inspection process. The goods on every transport line had to go through several rounds of inspection, and an alarm would be raised if there was even the slightest suspicious change. The inspection of the transport lines heading to the Legion's core areas was even stricter, and they would only be transported to the transport planes after multiple scans. Right now, a few large boxes were being dragged by the transport robots to a specific transport plane. These transport robots followed a specific route, and within this specific route, there would be a scanner that would perform several rounds of scanning and testing on the boxes they were dragging. The distance from the exit of the warehouse to the transport plane was less than 200 meters, but it had been scanned 5 times. This batch of goods were all medicinal goods, and the medicine inspection had been done when the boxes were packed. These few rounds of inspection were mainly to check if there were dangerous items, spy monitoring devices, abnormal conditions, and so on. After the transport robots had placed the large boxes into the transport plane's cargo hold, they turned around and continued to move the other boxes. 2 hours later, all the boxes that needed to be moved up had been moved. In reality, these transport robots could have moved the boxes in less than half an hour, but it was because of the extra 5 rounds of inspection that the time taken was several times longer. Still, the people of the 6th Legion had no complaints about this. The more times they were scanned, the safer it was, and they could rest assured. Alright, that's all for this batch of goods. I'll leave the rest to you. The person guarding the warehouse said to the transport soldiers. After the handover and registration was done, the 3 pilots and 20 or so guards boarded the plane and prepared to leave. The transport plane slowly drove from the runway at the warehouse to the port. To leave the planet, it had to depart from a specific flight field at the port. There, it would undergo a few more inspections and identity verification of the people inside the plane. After many verifications, the transport plane finally took to the sky. Its next destination was a planet at the 6th Legion's core area. While the transport plane was flying towards the target planet, 3 boxes inside the cargo hold opened quietly. "I'm suffocating," Knight said. A few people came out of the 3 boxes one after another. There were 3 people hidden in each box. When they were hiding in the boxes, they relied on breathing masks to maintain their cover. However, in order to prevent being detected during the test, they had to hold their breaths for a long time during the test. If they hadn't been trained, they would probably have suffocated to death. After coming out, the few of them took a deep breath of air. After all, the inside of the box was narrow and stuffy. Even the breathing masks were suffocating. This time, there were 9 people who had come, so it wasn't appropriate for more to come. Those who couldn't come over stayed on the planet with Prisa to guard the base and were trained by Prisa. In the plan that C.I. Jincheng and Silin had come up with, they would first infiltrate the cargo transfer planet and start with the cargo. This was the only place where they could take advantage of the situation. Before the carrier reached the core area but did not enter the target planet, they needed to find the planet Grayer was on. Time was still very tight. If they followed the carrier to the destination planet, it would be very difficult for the 9 of them to escape. Silin patted Huimao, who was looking left and right, and nodded at the boxes with his chin. In the next moment, Huimao walked next to the boxes, opened his mouth and spat out the medical materials he had swallowed. They couldn't use the subspace here. Originally, C.I. Jincheng was going to open the other boxes and fish out the materials from them to fill up these 3 boxes. But in the end, Huimao volunteered to help solve this problem. Also, C.I. Jincheng's equipment didn't detect anything after he swallowed some things during the pre-test. Huimao could still swallow things freely under the conditions of the non-subspace, and strangely enough, there was no suspicious mucus on those items. Weirdo. This was everyone's evaluation of Huimao. Because of this, Ghostclaw couldn't raise his head in front of Huimao with confidence. He became weak the moment he saw Huimao. Huimao wagged his tail proudly and looked at Ghostclaw, who was standing next to C.I. Jincheng pretending to observe other places. He thought to himself, I really don't know why they brought this burden here. After packing the items and putting the boxes back together, C.I. Jincheng and Silin began their search. Through the intercepted information, they analyzed the properties of some planets and deduced the planet Grayer might appear on. Huimao helped intercept the information. He didn't need to use any other equipment. All he had to do was crouch there and lick his claws while collecting information. Next to C.I. Jincheng, Ghostclaw stood on a special equipment and jumped around while using his claws to input some information. Sometimes, he used both his claws and mouth at the same time. He maintained a small spread of his wings to stabilize his body. Night, Yulu, and the others were resting and conserving their energy. Looking at the jumping Ghost Claw and Hui Mao, who was squinting his eyes like he was asleep but would occasionally input some information, Night sighed and said, "Sometimes, I feel like these animals are more intelligent than humans." It was true. It was hard to imagine how a seemingly normal animal could be so capable. The sensor equipment inside the cargo hold had been dealt with a long time ago, so they weren't afraid of being discovered. Normally speaking, no one would come to check before they arrived at the transport point. Knight looked at the time. This transport plane would soon leave warp mode. After leaving warp mode, Sillin and the others would only have a minute at most to carry out the final analysis. Soon. C.I. Jincheng said in a comforting tone. He and Sillin had already narrowed down the range by a lot. After the transport plane left warp mode, they would only need 15 seconds at most to carry out the confirmation. Knight silently counted the time. His estimation of time was very accurate. After the transport plane left warp mode, he counted another 12 seconds. Just as he finished counting to 12 seconds, Sillin said, "Found it." This sentence was like an action command. The moment he finished, Sillin and C.I. Jincheng began to quickly pack up the instruments in their hands. Knight and the others had already activated their special protective suits. After a hand gesture, the cargo hold door opened and Knight led the way out. They already knew the layout of this transport plane like the back of their hands. While waiting for Sillin and C.I. Jincheng's confirmation, they began to rehearse their next move in their minds. Right now, they were merely repeating the rehearsal in their minds. There was a hatch near the cargo hold. This was a hatch used specifically when transporting cargo. When Knight and the others approached the cabin door automatically opened. This was C.I. Jincheng's doing. They had 3 seconds to blind the carrier aircraft's defense network, and no one else on the carrier aircraft would know about this blinding. The 9 of them jumped out one after another. They turned invisible when they jumped out, which also allowed them to hide from radar and scanning equipment. Hui Mao hooked Sillin's arm with its tail. It did not spread its wings, too lazy to move. On the other hand, Ghost Claw flew out without any space protective equipment after wearing a special breathing mask. However, it could directly turn invisible because of its own body. That guy isn't that useless after all. Hui Mao looked at Ghost Claw that was gripping C.I. Jincheng's shoulder tightly and muttered. There were very few animals that could fly in space without any protection. Perhaps this was one of the reasons why C.I. Jincheng brought Ghost Claw with him. After confirming the planet, they flew slowly in that direction. Although they said it was slow, it was only relative to the transport plane and other tools. After all, the propellers on the protective suits were limited. The 6th Legion's patrol fleet would appear every now and then. Every time that happened, Sillin and the others would stop and wait for the patrol fleet to pass before continuing their flight. The good thing was that there were no asteroid belts around, and there weren't many space objects floating in space. This area should have been cleaned frequently. We can't continue like this, Knight said as he watched another patrol fleet pass by. Sillin looked at Hui Mao, who was lying on his arm, as if he didn't hear Knight at all. He poked him and said, "It's time to shine." Sillin understood Hui Mao's thoughts very well. However, before this, it was indeed inadvisable to make too big of a move when the situation wasn't clear. Now that they knew the patrol fleet's general patrolling area, direction, and time, they could speed up. Hui Mao's ears turned and he raised his head to look at the few people who were advancing at a turtle's pace. He grinned and said through the internal comms, "Fine, you guys are so pitiful. I'll help you guys." Hui Mao didn't transform into his mighty form. Changing his form randomly could cause magnetic fluctuations which would be noticed by some of the long-range detectors on the planet. Hui Mao was aware of this. Sillin had the others take out their ropes. One end was held by Hui Mao, and the other end was tied to themselves. "This will do." Hui Mao grabbed the rope and began to speed up. With Hui Mao's help, their speed was indeed much faster. They only slowed down when they were close to the confirmed planet. Inside the planet's surveillance station, the technicians were staring at the big screens in front of them. "Is there anything unusual today?" Someone walked in from outside and asked. "Nothing up until now. Other than the few patrols that passed by, there are no other abnormalities." "Amen, don't let your guard down." "Yes." While the technicians answered yes confidently, 9 people had already sneaked through the external defense network and entered the planet. The 9 of them acted according to the plan they had discussed earlier and snuck into this enormous research base. The research base was under the banner of military use, but the research inside might not be exposed to the public. Even the people of the 6th Army only knew some things on the surface. They didn't know anything deeper, such as some research that had been banned by the League of Stars a long time ago. Silen, Ci Jincheng, and Feng Haichao were in a group. In terms of shooting, Feng Haichao was not as good as Yu Lu. He was similar to Yu Lu in terms of stealth too. However, Feng Haichao was good in other aspects. This guy could hang upside down from the ceiling for a few hours without using any tools. Ghostclaw did not follow them into the base. He stayed in the sky outside the base and reported what he saw and the information he could intercept to Ci Jincheng. They did not use the common language of the League of Stars when they talked to each other. Instead, they used a small language that no one knew which corner of the League of Stars was from. Even if they used a small language, Ci Jincheng still used some coded words when he was talking to Ghostclaw. If Ci Jincheng did not explain, even if the people could understand the small language, they would not know what Ci Jincheng was trying to express. Silen and the other 2 hid in a corner of the base and did not go in recklessly. Ci Jincheng looked at the information he had collected. There was no clear mention of nightmare taper in the information he had stolen. However, there were some codes in the core experimental information that Ci Jincheng found suspicious. He circled 3 rune combinations and said to Silen, one of these 3 rune combinations might refer to the nightmare taper. Silen looked at the 3 rune combinations that Ci Jincheng circled and pointed at one of them. He said, "What information is there about this rune combination?" "I've seen this combination before. It should refer to something very confidential. The thing that this rune combination refers to is over at the 3rd zone of the base. However, the 3rd zone doesn't take up a big area in this base. The area was related to the degree of importance. The 3rd zone of the base did not take up a big area. This also meant that the project that was being carried out in this zone was not what the main person in charge, Glare, valued. However, Glare stayed in the 3rd zone the longest. Something was wrong. There was definitely something wrong with the 3rd zone. Correspondingly, there were a lot of access control devices around the 3rd zone. Both Ci Jincheng and Silen had their ways to get in, but they did not dare to go in recklessly if Glare was there. "Should we ask Knight and the others to cause some commotion over at the 7th zone and attract Glare there?" Ci Jincheng asked. Knight's operation team was very close to the 7th zone, and the 7th zone was a bit far away from the 3rd zone. If Glare went there, it would give them some time to investigate the problem at the 3rd zone. "No, don't let Knight and the others do anything first." Silen looked at the information Ci Jincheng had compiled. The 7th zone was indeed a bit far from the 3rd zone, but it was a problem to do something there without being discovered. Although Ci Jincheng had actually given Knight and the others some medicine and tools that could successfully cause certain things to happen at the experimental area, this wasn't the best outcome. Moreover, Glare might not necessarily go there himself. Instead, he might directly lock down that area because that was where the virus experiments were being conducted there. After looking at the current information and the general layout of the base, Silen pointed at the 8th zone and said, "It'll be better if we start from here." The 8th zone's progress was related to biochemical beasts. It was an experimental project that this planet was using as a cover. Every military had such experimental projects, and there was no need to hide them. The 8th zone took up a larger area, at least on the surface. If there was a problem with the project on the surface, Glare would go over and take a look even if he had to put on an act. It was to show how important this project was to the researchers and appease them. Scylla did not think that everyone in this base knew about the dream taper. There must be a very small number of people here who knew about the dream taper. Only those who were truly involved in the core research of the dream taper knew the true purpose of this base's existence. From the looks of it, the researchers in the other experimental zones definitely did not know about the actual situation. C.I. Jincheng understood Scylla's thoughts when Scylla pointed it out. This is a better target, but the problem is that the others are not close to the 8th zone. The further they were, the higher the possibility of being exposed. This was a higher risk. Scylla turned to look at Huimao, who was moving its claws on his shoulder, itching to try. He pointed at it and said to C.I. Jincheng, "Just leave it to it." Feng Haichao, who had not interjected all this while, looked at this fat cat suspiciously. He had a feeling that it was unreliable. With this cat's personality, who knew what kind of trouble it would cause? It was obvious that Feng Haichao did not know Huimao very well. Huimao might look unreliable normally, but it was still very capable when it came to serious matters. After some thought, C.I. Jincheng agreed and informed the others about what might happen next. To prevent Huimao from playing too much, Scylla had purposely pinched one of the cat's ears and reminded it. 40 minutes later, some trouble appeared at the 8th zone. It was said that something had gone wrong with the experiment. This kind of situation was more common in experiments like this, so the people in the other experimental zones were not surprised and ignored it. They were not in the mood to pay attention to the different experimental teams. At most, they would talk about it when they were bored. At the 8th zone, after some experimental animals were captured from the supervision room and injected with drugs, the experimenters would place them in some special cages. There were some test boards on both sides of the cages, and some images would be projected on the test boards to stimulate these animals who had been injected with drugs. When they saw something they did not like, these experimental animals would reach out their claws and scratch the test boards hard. The test boards would then perform a series of analysis on the depth, width, and trajectory of the scratches. Originally, the theoretical effect of the drug that had just been injected was very satisfactory. But now, it was unknown if the animals in the cages were terrified or had other thoughts. In short, their emotions were abnormal. Starting from the leopard in the middle, this anxiety spread. The test boards were quickly scratched, and the reflected data was arranged into a series of charts by the computer and displayed on the screens in front of the experimenters. The abnormal data caused the experimenters at the 8th zone to panic. Meanwhile, over at the 3rd zone. "Leader, there's a problem with the biochemical beast project. Right now, the experimenters over there can't control the emotions of the experimental animals at all. This goes against the theory. In other words, it failed again." Glire said slowly from his chair. No emotion could be heard from his voice. "Yes, that's right." The person standing in front of Glire was sweating on his forehead. He did not know what was going on over there. Moreover, similar situations were common in experiments like this, but he felt a lot of pressure when facing Glire. Glire sighed mockingly and stood up. "Let's go take a look, lest they report to the higher-ups that I'm neglecting them again." The mission was a success. Huimao squatted in a corner and watched the reactions of these people proudly. It didn't actually do anything, it just farted at the experimental animals in the cages. Then, the experimental animals started to go crazy. Chapter 406. While Huimao was driving those experimental animals crazy, other than the people who came over to report to Glar, there were also a few communication requests from Glar. It was probably the project manager of the experimental zone who came over to complain again. Glar knew what they were going to ask for next even if he didn't listen to them. Glar actually didn't care about the project over there at all. As one of the very few people who knew the truth about the existence of this experimental base, he naturally knew very well what it was. The 8th experimental zone was a cover. Just as Scylla had guessed, Glar's reaction after hearing that the experimental zone had failed again was enough to confirm that he didn't care about those things from Glar's current expression and indifferent actions. The fact that Glar was in charge of the third experimental zone was just a facade. On the surface, Glar was the vice team leader of the third experimental zone and the overall person in charge of the entire experimental base. When the other project team leaders looked down on Glar, this useless paratrooper, behind their backs, did Glar ever look them in the eye? Glar took out a few documents. He would do something he thought was more meaningful when he was listening to those boring old fellows discuss boring topics later. He still had a lot of experimental data in his hands that he hadn't analyzed yet. He didn't have the time to listen to those trashes boasting. What Glar didn't know was that 3 people had snuck into this experimental zone that didn't take up much space and wasn't valued on the surface right after he left the third experimental zone. Feng Haichao was powerful. There were a few times when he floated right over the heads of some researchers who were rushing in and out of the lab without being discovered. When it came to stealth, Ci Jincheng was slightly weaker than Silin and Feng Haichao. However, the technology he possessed made up for this weakness. Ci Jincheng could always find some small equipment on him to help him get through any difficulties. There were a lot of entrances to this experimental zone, but they were prepared beforehand. Adding on to the fact that there weren't that many workers on the surface, Silin and the others quickly advanced into the third experimental zone. There were many times when machines could increase efficiency and provide an absolute advantage in many aspects, but these were rigid machines after all. Some of the verification measures on the entrances had been cleverly broken by Silin and Ci Jincheng. 20 minutes. Silin gestured towards Ci Jincheng and Feng Haichao. This was the result of Huemao's estimation based on the situation on the other side. The exact time should not be too far off. As long as there were no accidents, Silin and the rest had 20 minutes to explore the secrets of the third experimental zone. Glaya would not leave this research area for too long. From the current information, other than the high-level meetings in this research base, other small meetings and unexpected matters would not take more than an hour. After that, Glaya would quickly return to the third research area. This also meant that there was some kind of experiment going on in the third experimental region, and Glare couldn't leave for too long. How is it? Silin combined the information he had gathered with the information Ci Jincheng had gathered. Feng Haichao stood guard outside. If someone came over, he would give a warning. There's something wrong with this room. Ci Jincheng pointed at a place on the detailed distribution map they had pieced together. It was Glare's office. Let's go and take a look. Silin sensed a lot of unusual machine language around him. These machine languages were invisible to normal people. Only Cheto and Huimao could see them. The place that Ci Jincheng was pointing at, which was Glare's office, obviously had more mechanical speech frequencies that did not match with the surroundings than other places. There were no soldiers guarding outside Glare's office. In fact, there were basically no guards inside this base, especially the core area of the experiment. The soldiers were stationed at the periphery or in separate areas. Inside the laboratory, there were more machines and scanners than anything else. There was no AI system here. It was unknown whether it was because Glare didn't trust AI systems or they couldn't create a trustworthy AI system. In short, this enormous base did not have an overall AI control center. Control was still in the hands of humans. This was good news for Silin. AI systems were much harder to deal with than other systems, and without such a control center, it only took Silin and Cheto half a minute to enter Glare's office. Although cracking the password to Glare's office in half a minute was already inconceivable to many people, they had already spent 1/40th of their time within the time limit. Including the time they used to come here, they only had 18 minutes and 26 seconds left. Glare had protected this place very well. Without his personal permission, he would never allow anyone to enter. After they entered, Feng Haichao and Ci Jincheng began searching for some important information and secrets in this place. The equipment Ci Jincheng carried couldn't display the situation in this place, and he couldn't discover the secrets hidden here. This office was protected by a very complicated defense net. It was possible to crack it, but Glare would probably be back by the time Ci Jincheng cracked it. Silin, what do we do? C.I. Jincheng turned around and was about to ask Sillin when he noticed that Sillin had walked next to Glaire's chair. After looking around, Sillin found a button on his handlebar and pressed it. A light screen popped up. Password? C.I. Jincheng was familiar with this. He had more contact with some of the equipment in the military, so he knew about them. He quickly cracked the password. After he keyed in the password, a hole opened up in the floor, and the chair sank. Sillin, C.I. Jincheng, and Feng Haichao jumped down one after another and stacked on top of each other. Sillin sat on the chair, C.I. Jincheng stepped on Sillin's shoulders, and Feng Haichao stepped on C.I. Jincheng's shoulders. After all, this place was limited. Beneath this research base, there was a secret underground laboratory. This laboratory was very well hidden, and there were only 12 researchers here. However, all 12 of them were the most outstanding researchers in the 6th division in this field, and they were all trustworthy. Those who did not trust them would be forced to come over through forceful means. 2 of the older ones had influence in this field that was comparable to Mo Heng's influence in mechanical engineering. It was obvious how much effort the 6th Army had put into this secret research. This underground laboratory was almost completely sealed off. These 12 researchers ate, drank, defecated, and slept here. If they wanted to leave, they would have to complete this research. Of course, Sillin wasn't optimistic about what the 6th Army would do to them after they were done. Although some of them were forced to do it, most of them did it willingly. They were very interested in this. When Glaire and the 6th Army's commander, Kakila, told them this news, they had been conducting this research with a fanatical attitude. They didn't think that the thing that was rumored to have been wiped out 20 years ago was still here. It really is the nightmare taper. Although he didn't see a sample of the nightmare taper, C.I. Jincheng was sure that this place was researching the nightmare taper from some data and analysis diagrams. After all, he had analyzed similar data for a long time. They're trying to activate a nightmare taper. Sillin also noticed something. Apart from being perfectly preserved, the nightmare taper that he could try to activate was rather healthy as well. They're 55% done with the activation. If they're given a little more time, I'm afraid they'll be the second to complete the activation. C.I. Jincheng frowned as he looked at the information he stole. They found a corner to hide after coming out from where the chair landed and began stealing the information. The amount of information they obtained was huge. The research here was progressing quickly. It was all thanks to Glaire. If he didn't infiltrate the core of Miracle directly, he definitely wouldn't have obtained this information and a complete and healthy nightmare taper. However, there's part of the information that we can't steal unless we're close enough to get the information from the devices. C.I. Jincheng was troubled. Time was tight, and he had no better way to get the information. However, they couldn't get close to the place themselves. The core laboratory definitely had the sample and the most important information. It was indeed worrying that they couldn't go there despite knowing that. It was because there were guard bugs there. There were some tiny bugs on the wall of the tunnel leading to the core laboratory. These bugs had a sharp sense of smell. They could identify changes in the environment based on the changes in the smell in the environment. These guard bugs were specially designed to deal with strangers. Even if they could avoid the mechanical alarms, it would be hard to fool these extremely sharp guard bugs. The smell signal could be transmitted to their brains faster, and the abnormal signal was quickly transmitted to the light plates they were attached to. Once a stranger went there and was discovered by the guard bugs, a beam of light would cut the intruder into pieces. "I'll go." After Sillin finished speaking, a layer of black armor covered his body. Then, the armor disappeared. Sillin, who was wrapped in the armor, disappeared as well. He was invisible, and it was a different kind of invisible. At least C.I. Jincheng, who was next to him, couldn't detect him with the device. Sillin followed a researcher who came out to relieve himself. The guards didn't notice Sillin. This made C.I. Jincheng and Feng Haichao let out a sigh of relief. But then, they became nervous. They didn't know where Sillin was now. Did he start passing through the tunnel that the guard bugs were attached to? After Silen entered this busy area, he walked towards the core laboratory. He was also observing the laboratory. This place took up a very large area. There were several large laboratories, and each laboratory had their own job. They were busy with the part they needed to decipher. Other than the complete specimen that was currently being activated, there were also some incomplete specimens similar to the ones in C.I. Jincheng's hands. However, it was obviously much easier for them to attack the parts after understanding the whole specimen. Looking at the emotions shown by the researchers wearing sterile clothes through their eye masks, Silen knew that their research was progressing smoothly. The large laboratories were all busy, and there were even some mechanical assistants helping them. However, there was no one at the core laboratory. Probably only Glire could go there. When he stepped into the tunnel that led to the core laboratory, Silen's footsteps slowed down. He observed the reaction of the guard bugs. Silen was careful with every step he took. Although he believed that the armor could cover his entire body, that even normal dead cells wouldn't fall here, and that his scent would be sealed, no one knew if there would be an accident, even if the possibility of an accident like this was only 1 in 100,000. As Silen moved slowly on this side, C.I. Jincheng and Feng Haicao's hearts were in their throats. They were ready to act in the event of an emergency. However, as the seconds passed, there were no abnormalities or alarms. Right now, Silen must be in the tunnel. The fact that the guard bugs didn't give off any alarms meant that Silen's method was working. On the other hand, Feng Haichao was puzzled. Why would Silen have such a high-level item? How did Silen have something that even the military might not have? He was just a hunter. Didn't a hunter's techniques all be bought with money? Right now, Silen didn't care what other people thought. He was already close to the area where the guard bugs were distributed. The best range of detection for the guard bugs was the entrance that Silen had come from. However, even though Silen had walked for such a long time in the best range of detection, it was inevitable that his nerves would be highly tensed when he came into close contact with these guard bugs. 1 step, 2 steps, Silen slowly moved from 3 meters away from the guard bugs to 2 meters, 1 meter, and then to a few centimeters away. When he was at the closest distance, the guard bugs still didn't react. This made Silen let out a sigh of relief. However, when he looked at the guard bugs, Silen felt a little strange. He couldn't tell why, but he just felt that something was wrong. After passing through the area where the guard bugs were, Silen arrived at the entrance of the core laboratory. He greeted C.I. Jincheng and entered the laboratory when no one was paying attention to him. In the laboratory, the most eye-catching thing was the 2-meter-tall cylindrical nutrition tank that was filled with liquid. There was a tiny thing inside the nutrition tank. It was impossible to see it if one didn't look closely. However, there were all kinds of tubes connected to external instruments and an activator that was shrunk all over the place where the tiny thing stayed. Bubbles would form and float up from time to time. That tiny thing was the nightmare taper. Hundreds of deadly viruses had been implanted into this tiny thing, and there might be even more that could be implanted after it was activated. This tiny thing was like a terrifying virus source. It could carry these extremely dangerous deadly viruses to a certain place and release them. This was just one nightmare taper that was not fully activated, so it would not be lethal. However, it was said that Miracle had successfully activated a mother and cultivated this mother to split into more nightmare tapers, which then continued to split. An activated nightmare taper was terrifying enough. One could only imagine what would happen if all the nightmare tapers mobilized and released the viruses at the same time in all the sectors of the League of Stars. There was something scarier than viruses in this world. There was actually a living thing that could withstand so many deadly viruses at the same time without being affected. No wonder Communidin would affirm the importance of parasites back then. Communidin might have discovered similar parasites back then, but those parasites were not as terrifying as the nightmare taper. No. The nightmare taper back then was also modified. After modification and targeted breeding, it became the nightmare taper today. So, what kind of parasite did Communidin see back then? Could it be the original nightmare taper's embryonic form? Or was it some close relative? Sillin had a great memory. He could clearly remember the documents that he had read. However, Sillin did not remember seeing anything similar in the information. There was nothing similar in Communidan's diary and other related records. Sillin squinted. Perhaps some people were not telling the truth and did not take out everything that belonged to Communidan. The device in his hand indicated that Sillin had copied all the information on the device. It had been 14 minutes until now. He had to leave as soon as possible. Sillin erased some of his traces and ensured that he wouldn't be discovered by glare. Then, he began to retreat. Sillin was still on high alert as he retreated. He would not let his guard down just because he had avoided the bug guards. It was always good to be more alert. When he finally returned to Ci Jincheng in Feng Haicao's hiding spot, Sillin passed the device to copy the information to Ci Jincheng. This action caused Feng Haicao's trust in Sillin to grow a little higher, because Sillin did not have the slightest intention of keeping it for himself. He handed the device to Ci Jincheng without hesitation. In reality, Feng Haichao did not know that Sillin had already read the information copied in the device a long time ago. However, he did not read it directly from this device. Instead, he read it from the devices in the lab. After obtaining the information they wanted, the trio quickly retreated. The trio was very careful not to leave any traces or scents on the chairs. Even if there were traces of someone sitting on the seats, they were restored to their original state. It had been exactly 20 minutes when they left the third lab area. Now that they were done with what they had to do, Sillin called Huimao back. While Weiss was retreating, it actually caused Glayer to suffer a little. It had tampered with a mechanical sampler a little, and when Glayer was passing through it, one of the sampler's supporting arms suddenly popped out and caught Glayer off guard. Unprepared, Glayer's abdomen was hit hard. He felt as if his organs were about to split open. However, it was a good thing that the machine was still a bit high. If it was any lower, it would have hit his family jewels. That would be a real pain in the ass for Glayer. Seeing his results, Huimao grinned and retreated. Sillin was already preparing to leave this base. Holding his stomach, Glayer returned to the third lab area with a cold expression. He lay on the chair and used the healing device to treat the injuries caused by the attack just now. At the same time, he checked some things out of habit. Suddenly, Glayer paused. After confirming again, a strange smile appeared on his face. Chapter 407. Sillin, Ci Jincheng, and Feng Haichao went back the way they came. Before the operation, they had planned a few escape routes. If they were discovered or for some other reason, they would have an escape route so they would not panic. However, it had been more than 10 minutes since Glayer returned to his office. There was no reaction from him. He did not sound the alarm or send more people to check. It seemed like Glayer did not notice anything out of the ordinary. Or maybe he did not notice anything in time. Or was there some other reason? It was not that Sillin was being paranoid. He had a weird feeling in his heart. There was no sense of success in completing the mission. There was nothing to be happy about. This was strange. No matter what, there was no alarm in this research base. Ci Jincheng seized the time to inform the others to retreat. He was afraid that the alarm would go off in the next moment. That would be troublesome. The device that Knight and the rest had on them would automatically copy all the information that they could steal from the area they were in. As long as they were not discovered, all Knight and the rest had to do was to walk around. They did not have to crack the password of those databases on purpose. They would not bother with some of the highly confidential ones. The main mission this time was to see if the nightmare taper experiment was going on and find out some related information. The rest was just a side mission. Once Sillin, Ci Jincheng, and the others were discovered, the others would create chaos everywhere to attract attention and share the pressure on Sillin's side. From the looks of it, things were going well. After Knight received Ci Jincheng's order to retreat, he led the other two people in his team and retreated according to the planned route. He saw a lot of research progress related to the 6th Army during this trip. It did not seem like there was anything particularly outstanding or advanced. Knight was very disappointed. However, the news from Silen diluted his disappointment. Any information about the nightmare taper was exciting. They could only count what they got now. There was just too little information about this thing. It was obvious that Si Fong was really ruthless back then. After meeting at the planned location, the few of them left the way they came. They waited for the cargo ships or carriers to come and go, found a suitable place to sneak in and left. Somewhere outside the border of the 6th Division's territory, Kong Man was piloting a spaceship and waiting with a few others. After the 6th Division's cargo spaceship left, Kong Man's spaceship was revealed. Not far away in space, a cat was dragging a few people over. That cat. The person beside Kong Man wanted to say something but stopped. His expression was very conflicted. He didn't expect cats to be so useful. Kong Man shook his head and pressed the button to open the hatch to let the people outside in. How is it? Before Silen and the others could steady themselves, Kong Man and the others ran over and asked. Si Jincheng made a smooth sailing gesture and Kong Man's face lit up with joy as well. He ran back into the cockpit and began to return at full speed. He could not wait to find out more information about those things. Although this trip did not seem spectacular, the information that they found was enough to excite them. With this information, the research on the nightmare taper would speed up. Perhaps they could resolve the disaster that they predicted soon. Knight and the others had already started resting. Their nerves had been stretched taut during the operation, and even when they were being dragged by the gray cat, they were still on high alert for anything that might suddenly appear around them. Now that they were finally back, they had to recover their strength as soon as possible. Si Jincheng did not rest. He looked at the information in his hand. Since they were on the operation earlier, he did not have much time to look at the information, especially the core information about the nightmare taper that Silen had gotten his hands on. It made Si Jincheng very excited, so he quickly flipped through the research information. Ghost Claw had already found a place to hide and sleep. It was not far from Si Jincheng. If that cat came to bully it again, it could get Si Jincheng's help as soon as possible to avoid getting its fur plucked again. Actually, Hui Mao did not have the mood to care about Ghost Claw. To it, Ghost Claw was not qualified enough. If it wanted to fight, it should look for that stinky rat. If it wanted to play with a pet, it should be a big guy like Blue Skin that could stand up. If it wanted to play games, of course it should look for Cheto, Sigma, and Moon. Therefore, no matter what Hui Mao thought, Ghost Claw was not in its consideration. When there was nothing to play with and nothing to eat, Hui Mao could only sleep. Hui Mao, who was curled up on Silen's lap, did not sleep well either. It could feel Silen's mood. Such an aura was not suitable for sleeping. What's wrong? Hui Mao scratched Silen's pants with its paw. Silen, who was deep in thought, looked down at the curious Hui Mao and scratched its chin. It's nothing. I'm just thinking about something. There are some things that I haven't figured out yet. You humans just like to think blindly. It's easy to turn you into an idiot if you think too much, Hui Mao said seriously. Silen smiled and did not answer. It was not easy to be thoughtless. Silen had a strange feeling. It was a very strange feeling. In short, it was not a good feeling. Although Silen had learned that Glaer's research base hadn't shown any unusual reactions up until now, he still couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The moment he closed his eyes, he would think of Glaer's office. Then, his brain would replay the process of his previous actions one by one. Until now, every detail of this operation would be replayed in Silen's mind. What's wrong? Where? Silen closed his eyes and the scenes replayed in his mind. Glaer's chair appeared in his mind for a long time. Then, he went down the tunnel and arrived at the underground laboratory. He went invisible, passed by the busy laboratory, went to the tunnel, and arrived at the guard insects. Silen could clearly feel the antennae on the noses of the guard insects. Guard insects, Silen suddenly opened his eyes. There was something wrong with those guard insects. Every person who passed through the tunnel, whether they were familiar or unfamiliar, would cause the guard insects to react. It was just that familiar people would not cause the guard insects to give off a warning. And the guard insects that Sillin saw were too comfortable. They were comfortable as if they had not been stimulated by a smell for a long time. Wasn't that the core laboratory? Shouldn't Glire go there every day to take a look? Even if it was Glire, a familiar smell should have stimulated the guard insects to react. However, the situation of the guard insects was not like this at all. It was as if they had not been stimulated by a foreign smell for at least 5 days. Sillin was thinking too deeply that he did not notice that the finger that was scratching Huimao's chin was tugging at Huimao's beard. Huimao looked at Sillin, who was deep in thought, and flicked his ear. Never mind, I'll let him tug at my chin for a while. I'll extort a bunch of compensation money when I come back to my senses. When Sillin and the others left the 6th Army's area and returned to C.I. Jincheng's place, Glire sent a message from Glire's office in the 3rd experimental area of the base. This place has finally been discovered. After turning off the communicator, Glire looked at his chair with a strange smile on his face. Right now, the chair had already been disassembled. There were some scratches at the bottom of the chair. Every time the chair descended, an almost undetectable scratch would appear at the bottom of the chair. Glire's daily habit was to count these scratches. It was hard to imagine that in a place filled with all kinds of advanced equipment, where even the dead skin that naturally fell off from a human body could be detected, Glire would actually use such a primitive and simple physical method to check if anyone had entered the underground laboratory. But it had to be said that sometimes, the most primitive method was the most overlooked. In reality, the place that Glire paid the most attention to in the entire research base was not the underground experimental area or the core laboratory, but the journey that the chair took from the surface to the underground. During this process, the extra undetectable scratch at the bottom of the chair was what Glire waited for every day. Every time Glire went out and returned, Glire would habitually count these scratch marks. It's finally here, hee. Glire lay on the table and laughed so hard that his entire body was shaking. He looked like an abnormal patient. After Sillin and the others returned to C.I. Jincheng's place, Sillin borrowed C.I. Jincheng's equipment and contacted Nada. Nada was one of the Fog's assassination targets some time ago, but he was lucky enough to only be injured. He had mostly recovered by now. Sillin had visited Nada after the 2-team battle, and he was not in mortal danger. Although Nada's strength was not at the top of the Vanguard's upper echelon, his vigilance and self-protection ability were definitely at the top. Otherwise, in that assassination attempt, the 2 upper echelon members who were stronger than Nada had unfortunately died, while Nada only suffered a minor injury. In Nada's own words, Sector S's prison wasn't for nothing. Sillin and Nada would contact each other occasionally. Sillin didn't know a lot of Vanguard's higher-ups, and Songba Leruo, Bart and Nada were the ones he was more familiar with. The trio had helped Sillin a lot, so Sillin would contact them when he was free. It was just that most of the time, no one had much free time. Yo, why did you think of contacting me? On the screen, Nada looked pretty spirited. I'm here to see how you're recovering, and to verify some things. Sillin said. Oh. Nada raised his slightly white eyebrows. Tell me. I won't hide anything if I can answer you. It's about Senior Komuniden. Sillin looked at Nada. I want to confirm if you've given me all of Senior Komuniden's records regarding the parasite just like you said before. Nada wasn't surprised by Sillin's question. Right now, the League of Stars was feeling a little uneasy, and they had heard some rumors about it. As a higher-up of Vanguard, Ji Feng would tell them some top-secret information. After a moment of silence, Nada stared at Sillin once more before sighing. I promised him that I wouldn't take it out easily. Even if the commander asked me to, I wouldn't take it out just like that. Komuniden once said that that thing would become a great killing weapon in the hands of some people. Nada was observing Sillin's facial expression while saying this, trying to guess Sillin's current thoughts. However, to Nada's surprise, Sillin was very calm. He was so calm that it was as if he had already guessed what he was going to say next. What do you know? Nada asked. Sillin shook his head. I know a little about what you guys know. When the time comes, once the disaster breaks out, it doesn't matter if the team is prepared to stay away from populated areas or give up the original base. No matter what, I'm prepared to stay. Therefore, I need some of Senior Komunidin's records. That's good too. If you can find a solution, we won't have to look for more difficult areas to avoid, Nada said. Although Nada said this, in fact, Ji Feng had already chosen the difficult areas to avoid. They were all remote planets, and there were even some planets with C-grade habitability. Even if the living environment was harsh, it was better than suffering in the central area. It wasn't just Vanguard. The other hunter regiments had probably already chosen their escape routes. And the purge of the hunter world that they were preparing to carry out gradually calmed down. No one knew what the various parties had received. It was only calm on the surface. Not long ago, when Ji Feng held a meeting with the higher-ups, they had already begun to make their move. They were going to snatch a batch of resources before the disaster broke out. Vanguard and Lan Huti would make their move against Heaven's Birth soon. None of this was known to outsiders. What outsiders knew was that the hunter regiments had received the news and were preparing to escape. Nada left for a while, and when he reappeared, he was holding a notebook in his hand. This is another notebook outside of the parasitic code. Originally, Komunidin wanted to record all of these in the parasitic code, but in the end, he chose to record them separately. As Nada spoke, he flipped open the notebook and showed Sillin one page at a time. In fact, the notebook wasn't thick, and it didn't take long for him to flip through the pages. What do you think? Nada smiled and looked at Sillin, wanting to see some annoyance on Sillin's face. However, when he found that Sillin still had the same calm expression that made people want to slap him a few more times, Nada's words of ridicule stopped abruptly. There were two reasons why Nadakin took out the notebook that Komunidin had specifically instructed him to. 1. He hoped that Sillin could find a way to help the Vanguard avoid this disaster. If Sillin succeeded, then it would absolutely be a great thing for the Vanguard, and one could well imagine how much influence they would have in the hunter world. As for the second reason, it was because of the record book itself. Nada had read this notebook many times, but he still couldn't find anything. He couldn't understand it. Yes, he couldn't understand it. Nada also knew a little about parasites because of Komunidin. He could understand some of Komunidin's previous notebook, but he couldn't understand anything in this notebook. Because it was all code. Komunidin said that this was his record of the life code. Whoever could understand his parasitic code should also be able to understand it. Therefore, Nada often thought, did I not understand parasitic code? It was estimated that in the entire Vanguard, besides Sillin, Nada himself was the most familiar with parasitic code. Who would have thought that Nada couldn't understand the other notebook left by Komunidin? That's it? Sillin asked. That's it. There are also some specimens. You know, although you didn't take them all, you have seen them all. Now, I'll tell you everything. Nada closed the notebook in his hand. He would not give this notebook away. He could let others see it, but he couldn't let it leak out, at least not now. If it was lost or used by some people in the wrong way, he would be too sorry for Komunidin. He didn't give it to Ji Feng even when he asked for it. He just glanced at Ji Feng. The result of Ji Feng's glance was that his face was full of regret and twisted. It was the same expression Nada had when he first saw this notebook. No matter how important it was useless if he couldn't understand it. Then that's it. Rest well and let's cut the nonsense. We'll talk next time. Sillin didn't wait for Nada to flip out and ended the communication. Nada's face twitched at the communicator that had lost its signal. Was he going to throw it away after using it? He really wanted to grab that bastard Sillin and kick him hard. Also, Nada's heart felt like it was being scratched by a cat. Looking at Sillin's expression, he should have understood it, right? Right? He should have. But why didn't he say anything? Nada hesitated while he was in a dilemma. In the end, he didn't tell Ji Feng. He didn't want to rejoice for nothing. On the other side, Silen entered C.I. Jincheng's laboratory area after he had imprinted the information recorded in the notebook that Nada had kept in secret into his mind. Over there, C.I. Jincheng had arranged a laboratory for Silen. Hui Mao crouched on the table next to him and watched as Silen inputted a long string of unknown characters into the notebook. Then, he cut out some of the characters, pieced them together, and converted them. This process was repeated many times. Hui Mao was about to fall asleep watching, but Silen's hands showed no signs of slowing down. After a yawn, Hui Mao went to a counter next to the door of this laboratory and lay down. He closed his eyes to rest. With it here, no one could come in and disturb him at this time. Silen's hands moved quickly. Although he was repeating similar tasks, the sequence he put together every time was different. There were already more than 100 sequences on an instrument next to him. They were all put together by Silen, and the number was still increasing. When Silen saw the characters on the notebook, he didn't understand them at first. But when he recalled some of Communidan's annotations and key points in the parasite code he had read before, he could see some hints from the characters. They were just hints, Silen had to confirm the rest. After putting together a few sequences, Silen confirmed his thoughts. Every sequence he decoded was a certain gene sequence from a certain parasite. Decoding was only the first step. After the assembly was complete, Silen needed to filter and intercept the sequences once more. This was a huge calculation and analysis process, and it wasn't something a computer could do alone. It was because he had to incorporate some things from the parasitic code. According to Silen's prediction, the final result would be the nightmare taper's initial form after decoding all of them. It was the genetic information before it was modified at all. Chapter 408. Recently, all kinds of rumors in the League of Stars had made people anxious. Although some important people had come out to calm down, some things were still stirring in the dark. Other than the Big Four, the other hunters had already started migrating. They liked to roam the galaxy in the first place, and this unknown news made them nervous. It was always good to be prepared. Some of the scattered adventurer organizations began to make preparations. Some of them took this opportunity to make money and strengthen their own teams. At the same time, they were afraid that they would release some false information. Things that were originally non-existent became even more mysterious. The local governments of the various sectors tried their best to control this suppressed commotion, but to no avail. On the military side, someone leaked information about the activities of the 8 great armies, saying that they were searching for something terrifying. This made the already suspicious citizens even more anxious. Looking at the situation, it didn't look like it was fake. Also, military enthusiasts knew a little about the current 8 great armies. The videos that were publicized on the internet allowed them to find too much evidence. Although this video had not existed for a long time, under the verification of some professionals, the local government's criticism of the video seemed to have exposed something. Inside C.I. Jincheng's base, C.I. Jincheng hadn't slept for a few days. He sent a copy of the newly collected information to the C.I. family. There would be a project team there to analyze and follow up. At the same time, C.I. Jincheng was also researching in his own way. In the past few days, Knight and the others were speechless when they saw C.I. Jincheng. This man with bloodshot eyes, messy hair, stubble, and a strong sense of decadence was C.I. Jincheng. In the past, this guy paid a lot of attention to his appearance. It was obvious how much pressure C.I. Jincheng was under right now. Knight and the others understood. Because of their identities, they knew a lot of things that were hard for others to find out. The recent movements of the armies did indicate that the cleanup of Miracle was not going smoothly. The rumors that were circulating in the League of Stars weren't completely fake. Someone was leaking information. It could be Miracle, or it could be other forces. No matter what, whether the rumors were true or false, they all foretold one thing: a disaster was about to happen. Recently, Knight and the others had been spending all their time in the training room, training to adapt to various conditions. No one knew what the conditions would be like in the place they were going to next. If they did not prepare, they would not have the time to adapt when the time came, and they would be the ones suffering. Just like C.I. Jincheng, Silen was holed up in his own lab. He was almost done deciphering the records that Komuniden left behind. As he continued to decipher them, he was getting closer and closer to the nightmare taper's initial form. The relationship between the primary form of the parasite in the beginning and the modified nightmare taper was crucial. Perhaps he could understand this powerful parasite better if he could learn more about it from its primary form. Even Miracle's people might not have complete information about the nightmare taper's original form. That information had been wiped out during the taper extermination operation almost 20 years ago. Even if it was not completely wiped out, there would not be much left. However, no one would have thought that a long time ago, an unknown hunter would record such a thing and this creature. However, he passed away before he could officially name this creature. It was only when the nightmare taper was discovered and modified by Miracle's people that this parasite spread in a small circle. Cheto had successfully obtained the sample from Achenthus. Silen did not analyze the sample immediately. Instead, he asked Cheto to help C.I. Jincheng. At first, C.I. Jincheng was reluctant. He preferred to explore alone when he was doing research. On the other hand, he thought that an assistant would be a hindrance. It would be fine if it was Silen. C.I. Jincheng acknowledged Silen's abilities, but C.I. Jincheng was too unfamiliar with Cheto. To be honest, C.I. Jincheng did not really trust robots. However, after C.I. Jincheng witnessed Cheto's abilities for himself, he slowly acknowledged him. Cheto was able to analyze problems that even professionals found hard to analyze. C.I. Jincheng thought about it and agreed. How could a person trained by Silen possibly be bad? The days passed by in such a tense atmosphere. Silen did not have the energy to deal with the messages and communication requests inside the communicator, so he asked Hui Mao to handle them for him. Ji Feng, Nada, Yudi and Hidden Wuxia all received the same reply from the cat: Silen is busy. If it's not a life-threatening emergency, wait until he's done. On this day, the base welcomed another member. It was still the same face that made women overflow with motherly instincts. It was still the same person who liked to look at people with his chin, the unconcealable arrogance, and the same awkward personality. The newcomer was the other person who was once called the Twin Stars of Seven Lights along with Kong Man in Seven Lights, Pride. Yo, Pride. Why are you here now? I thought you'd contact us when it's true. Knight said while rubbing his neck and swinging his arms. He had just been tortured by Prisa, and his face was still wounded. However, wounds like this would recover very quickly, and it was nothing to Knight who was already used to it. Pride, however, was different. He curled his lips and looked disdainful when he saw Knight's terrible condition. If I don't come now, I don't think I'll have a chance at all in a few days. Pride answered impatiently. The 4th Legion has been quite active lately. Knight frowned. From what he knew, the 4th Legion's inactivity was one thing, but once it was active, it meant that things were really troublesome. While walking, Pride said indifferently, it's still the same. Isn't your 3rd Legion and C.I. Jincheng's 7th Legion about the same? Everyone knows what's going on right now. A disaster is probably unavoidable, so we can only scare the people first. When I came here, I heard that the 2nd Legion had captured another batch of Miracle higher-ups. However, these higher-ups committed suicide in a very strange way, just like the ones who were captured before. All they said before they died was a nightmare is coming. The 2nd Legion was where the Yu family was located, and these higher-ups who were captured actually used to have dealings with the 8 Great Legions. Now, they seem to have hardened their hearts and gone crazy. Pride's elder brother Ji Money and second brother Ji Feihang both said that these people were captured on purpose. If they really wanted to escape, they could have run far away, but these people chose to be captured and injected themselves with drugs before they were captured. Once the time was up, they would die. Their bodies would turn gray, stiff, and then shatter into a pile of ashes. Pride's grandfather said that these people seemed to be protecting someone, and the person who had been hiding behind the scenes and evading the 8 Great Legions joint investigation might very well be the person who controlled the awakened Dream Taper's main body. As long as the main body was under control, the other Dream Tapers would listen to his orders and continuously spread the virus. Unless the main body stopped them, the Dream Tapers that carried all kinds of fatal viruses would spread the virus endlessly. Let's not talk about those depressing things, Pride waved his hand. He was especially disgusted by these things. He had disliked this miracle company since a long time ago, but some people just didn't believe it and kept getting involved. Now look at it, not only was it a mess, they even dragged a large number of people into it. This time, it wasn't just some people from Miracle who were captured, a batch of people from the military had also been transferred from top to bottom. Pride did not know about the other legions, but at least the 4th Legion was like this. Half of the high-ranking generals had been replaced. How's the progress on CI Jincheng's side? Didn't they say that they found a sample a while ago? Pride asked. The progress is a little faster, but personally, I don't think we'll make it in time to find a solution. CI Jincheng is probably under a lot of pressure right now. Pride guessed. Knight felt that his shoulder was hurting again. It really was a pretty heavy topic when he brought up this topic. You'll understand when you see CI Jincheng. Pride was still wondering why Knight would have such an expression when he mentioned CI Jincheng, but when he saw CI Jincheng with his own eyes, his jaw couldn't close for a long time. How long has it been since he last rested? Pride asked Knight. I don't know. Right now he's basically staying inside that laboratory all the time. It's fine now that Cheto is helping him, but when he was alone before this, he was practically like a primitive man recorded in the data. How terrifying. Pride shuddered. Thank goodness he wasn't a student of this. After looking around, Pride asked, didn't they say that little bastard Sillin has returned? Where is he? He's not slacking off, is he? Pride had gone to the training room to greet everyone, and then went to the lounge to put down his things. Now that he had seen CI Jincheng, he didn't see the curious Sillin either. It had been many years since they last met, and Pride had seen the current investigation information on Sillin. This person looked even more infuriating than before. Knight was about to answer when he saw Huimao crouching on a metal frame inside the passageway and looking in their direction. Wheeze, has Sillin finally come out? Knight said to Huimao. Huimao looked at Knight and Pride, yawned, then raised his chin and answered lazily, yes. The corner of Knight's eyes twitched. Was this cat competing with Pride to see who could raise their chin higher? In the past, Knight thought that other than an idiot like Pride, there wouldn't be another idiot like him. He didn't think that he would actually meet a fellow who dared to raise his chin and glare at Pride, and the tone of his reply was one of disdain. He didn't know if it was directed at Knight or Pride. In short, Knight felt 2 intense gazes filled with arrogance and contempt colliding in the air. These 2 species were incompatible. That was Knight's feeling. While they were talking, Celine walked over. He seemed to have freshened up and was in better spirits. Right now, he was holding a hardtack and a cold drink in his hand, eating. Pride? Celine said while chewing on a biscuit. There was no need to look at his face. Just by looking at the fellow who was competing with Huimao to see who could raise their chin higher, he knew that it was the always proud Pride from his memories. Ah! Celine, you stole my biscuit. Huimao, who was competing with Pride to see who had the strongest contempt in his eyes, ignored Pride after Celine came over. He smelled a familiar scent. Here's my share. Celine answered calmly before taking out another heated biscuit and tossing it to Huimao, yours. Huimao caught the biscuit and flicked his ears. He ignored Pride now that he had something to eat. Pride looked at the person in front of him and was about to say something when Knight cut him off. Celine, you and CI Jincheng have stayed in the lab for such a long time already. You should rest a little more. The brain needs rest too. Pride, who was about to make sarcastic remarks out of habit, didn't say anything after hearing Knight's words. Right now everyone was busy thinking of a solution. It wasn't easy for anyone, and every new result was a ray of hope. To be honest, although Pride wasn't interested in that area, he really admired them. Although Silen wasn't as exaggerated as Ci Jincheng, he also looked tired. Amen, go take a nap after eating. We'll continue after we've gotten some results. You guys chat first, I'm going in. After a brief greeting to Knight and Pride, Silen continued into the lab. He closed his eyes and rested for a moment before continuing his work. That genetic information had been deciphered, which was why he could take a break. Silen's next step was to combine Ci Jincheng and Cheto's results and conduct an in-depth analysis. Not long after Silen entered the lab, Ci Jincheng also came out. After freshening up, he couldn't be bothered to chat with Pride anymore. Just now, Silen had sent him a very important piece of genetic information. His workload would be even greater from now on, and Ci Jincheng knew where his limits were. That was why he and Silen agreed to take a break and replenish their brain power first before continuing their research. As for Cheto, he was still busy with Ci Jincheng's unfinished work. To him, he wouldn't feel tired even if he worked like this for 10 years straight. As long as he had enough energy, he could continue. Just like Ci Jincheng said, Cheto was a great contributor. 2 days later, Alan returned to the base. Alan was also Silen's former schoolmate at Seven Lights. Alan already knew some things about Silen. Ever since he left Seven Lights, Alan had been very close to the Andryra family. He had always been paying attention to Kong Man and Pride's movements. However, it was very difficult for Alan to follow up on someone with Pride's background. As for Kong Man, he was poached by the Ci family after graduation, and he couldn't be found. Later on, he worked with Ci Jincheng under Lung's matchmaking. Alan personally went into battle and reported some of the Ci family's 7th Corps. Right now, Alan was the organizer of Stars of Tomorrow. This electronic magazine did not have more than 60 contribution points in the League of Stars. It was far inferior to old giants like Limitless and Luxury, which had more than 80 contribution points. However, there were more young people who would pay attention to Stars of Tomorrow because the characters and deeds inside were all young people. There were people who were in their 20s to 30s. The people inside Stars of Tomorrow were not people that the public of the League of Stars were familiar with, nor were they big shots that they felt were out of reach. The reason the young people loved to pay attention to this was mainly because the characters inside were about their own age. Everyone liked to pay attention to people who were about the same age as them, and some parents loved to watch it as well. They would always use the outstanding characters inside to motivate their children. Ever since Alan's old man passed the Stars of Tomorrow to Alan often traveled around and personally came into contact with these people. There was a period of time when Alan personally went to interview some of the recruits who had made great contributions to the military who appeared in the Stars of Tomorrow. In the eyes of the public of the League of Stars, the 7th Army Corps that the Ci family belonged to was much better than the 5th Army Corps. It was also much better received by the public than the other armies. This was also one of the reasons why Ci Jincheng agreed to cooperate with Alan. Alan's goal was to increase the contribution points of the Stars of Tomorrow in the League of Stars from rank 60. He hoped that this electronic magazine could reach rank 70 or even rank 80 in his hands. Correspondingly, Alan would have to put in a lot of effort. He had personally gone to the front lines many times, personally experienced those things, came into contact with those people, and reported the truest side of them. It was only in those kinds of environments and conditions that such people were the most attractive and admirable. Alan's visit this time was not permitted by his father. It was entirely Alan's own idea. In reality, most of the people who came here were of their own will. Their families hadn't agreed to it, like Pride who had escaped and Knight. The Fiegler family had also requested for Knight to return many times, but Knight kept repeating the same words over and over again. After arguing with his old man for the 9th time, Knight no longer paid attention to the communication on the receiver and dove straight into the training room to begin the next stage of adaptation training. Every time they started a new stage of training, they would come out with a body full of injuries. Other than having to adapt to different gravity environments, different atmospheric composition and so on, they also had to deal with Prisa's attacks. It was no wonder that every time they came out, they looked like they were half dead. Amidst everyone's nervousness and the military's activities grew more and more frequent, one day, in Ci Jincheng's base, a sharp alarm caused everyone to stop what they were doing. This alarm, fuck. It's starting. The people in the training room and those who were resting hurriedly ran towards Ci Jincheng. Since the first day they came to this base, Ci Jincheng had told them what the various alarms in this base represented, and the one that was going off right now was a disaster announcement. Other than the base's alarm, Knight had also received a message from the Fiegler family. They were still asking him to return. After Knight read the message, he replied with the same words as before. Then, he turned off his receiver and headed towards Ci Jincheng's location with everyone else. At the same time the alarm went off, Silen's personal communicator also responded. There were a few messages on the communicator from different people. There were from Ji Feng, Yudi, Anginia, Yin Wuxia, Shi Huajing, Yu Linglong. All of these people's urgent secret messages to Silen mentioned the same thing: the nightmare taper had officially appeared. Chapter 409. Not long after the 8 armies moved out to capture another batch of Miracle's high-ranking members, they all died. 10 days later, more than 20 sectors in the League of Stars reported the outbreak. If it was just one sector, it could be understood as a normal outbreak. However, this time, more than 20 sectors in the League of Stars were experiencing the outbreak at the same time. Furthermore, after the outbreak spread at an extremely fast rate. Currently, the number of deaths reported by the various sectors was increasing rapidly. Every sector had its own active planets and its relatively inflexible ones. This time, most of the outbreak occurred on the transit planets of that sector. Even if it wasn't a transit planet, it would still be a planet with a lot of human activity. They were like a source of infection. The infected people would leave the planet in a hurry and bring the virus to another planet. Then, the vicious cycle would begin once more. One nightmare taper was all that was needed to destroy a planet. Right now, there were at least 20 nightmare tapers scattered throughout the League of Stars. This included sectors A, B, and C. The epidemic had been detected in the areas under the jurisdiction of the 8 great armies. Although it was not a transit planet in that area, and it was not a planet that was particularly important, it was still a place under their jurisdiction. There were soldiers, warriors, and other personnel of their respective armies on the planet. At a time like this, they couldn't give up completely. Morale couldn't be lowered. No one could give up at the start. Just like what the politicians were doing right now, they had to incite the people to fight back and take action. Once the soldiers felt despair at the start, all subsequent actions would deviate from the plans of the 8 marshals. After receiving the news, Silen contacted Yudi and asked him about the current situation of the 11th Squadron. Just as Silen had expected, because of Pango's presence, Ji Feng had ordered the 11th Squadron to follow them and stay away from important areas. Not long ago, Ji Feng and Lan Hudi had worked together to wipe out one of Heaven's Birth squads and assassinate a group of high-ranking members. Based on the information Silen had received from Wuxia, Ji Feng and Lan Hudi were currently preparing to join forces and kill the leader of Heaven's Birth, Bloomer. Most likely, Bloomer wouldn't have imagined that at a time like this, Ji Feng and Lan Hudi would be preparing to kill him. Ji Feng wasn't as honest as he looked. Silen knew that Ji Feng had a lot of tricks up his sleeves. Moreover, during the last assassination attempt, Silen suspected that Ji Feng had purposely made it look like he was heavily injured. Perhaps, at that time, Ji Feng had already made preparations. Since Ji Feng was confident in his ability to kill Bloomer, Silen wasn't interested in knowing whether or not Bloomer would be killed. At a time like this, the celestial Heaven's Birth would definitely split apart. Ji Feng and Lan Hudi were using the Nightmare Taper as an excuse to remove the Celestial Heaven's birth from the four great alliances. While everyone was busy running for their lives, they were busy splitting the four great clans into three great clans. It was a good move to catch them off guard, and it saved them a lot of effort. The spies they planted in Heaven's birth must have also contributed a lot, and there must have been external forces helping them as well. As long as he knew that the 11th squad was doing well, Silen didn't care about anything else. After his call with Yudi, Silen arrived at a meeting room next to C.I. Jincheng's lab. This meeting room was a little special. It wasn't like the other strict and formal meeting rooms. Here, everyone could choose their own seats, and there were all kinds of display boards hanging around the room. There was also exercise equipment. By the time Silen arrived at the meeting room, everyone was already present. Knight and two other people were at the exercise equipment. Some were punching while others were running with weights. Kong Man was writing something on an electronic board, Pride was playing a game, and Yu Lu was studying an antique rifle. Sorry, I'm late. Silen pulled out a random chair and sat down. Hui Mao was strolling around the meeting room. There weren't any strict rules for these people to attend a meeting here anyway, and there was even someone eating in the corner. It's fine, I just got here. C.I. Jincheng pinched the space between his brows. The progress of his research still hadn't caught up to this matter, and this made C.I. Jincheng very tired. C.I. Jincheng pressed a button on his controller, and a projection appeared at the center of the meeting room. It was a star map. Every sector in the League of Stars was displayed in it. This is the image compiled from the latest information we've received. The planets marked in red are the planets where the Nightmare Taper first appeared, and the planets marked in orange are the ones that are being reinfected. According to the information we have now, there are already 75 types of deadly viruses, and there are no absolute vaccines for them. It's still fine if they are discovered in time and injected with drugs to alleviate the symptoms. However, these viruses have all been mutated. Many vaccines and drugs created in the past are not very effective, not to mention that there are some new types of viruses, artificial viruses. C.I. Jincheng sorted out the information he received and shared it with everyone. Knight, Pride, and the others passed the new information to C.I. Jincheng. They didn't know much about viruses, so it was fine to just know the general situation. The 8 Corps were no longer fighting each other, and the few political families at Sector A had stopped their civil war as well. They were contacting the local governments to deal with this matter. Before this, they had come up with all kinds of countermeasures, and the League of Stars wasn't without cause. They had been making arrangements, and they were all busy right now. Shi Huajing had been busy ever since he contacted Silen briefly at the beginning. Silen knew about his situation, and did not disturb him after he received Shi Huajing's message. Right now, everyone had gathered the information they obtained from various channels and obtained the detailed military layout on the projection at the center of the meeting room. The information Silen brought out especially far exceeded C.I. Jincheng and Knight's expectations. They never thought that Silen would be able to obtain so much secret and detailed information. When I formed this Taper Extermination Squad, I told you that the place we're going to is definitely a disaster zone, and a disaster zone that's been half abandoned. Then where are we going next? Pride stared at the distribution of the markers on the star map and frowned. The 8 Corps and the big families were quite capable when they worked together. At the very least, the few planets that Pride had set his eyes on had been deployed a long time ago. I'm just curious why so many planets had slipped through the net during the strict cleansing earlier. Knight's expression was serious and murderous. Right now, he was venting this murderous intent directly on the punching cushion in front of him. Everyone knew how destructive the Nightmare Taper was when so many families of the 8 great military legions worked together to annihilate the Nightmare Taper, so why did so many of them slip through the net even though they knew how important they were? Not only that, they were all on very important planets. Even within the jurisdiction of the 8 great military legions, there were Nightmare Tapers in the political families of Sector A. There was one possibility, and that was that the spies had not been completely eliminated. Moreover, the spies among them were all holding important positions. Even those with weak governing power could not have done this. This did not mean that all of these people were spies. It was possible that they still wanted to monopolize the nightmare taper for their own use. For example, the 6th Legion was wavering. It was exactly because of this that some people took advantage of the situation to infiltrate. If they had Xifang's determination back then, would something like this still happen? Xifang's military strength back then was far inferior to the current Grand Alliance, but that was the most successful operation that Knight knew of. A bunch of old foxes. The cushion broke with a pop. Knight's punch force had exceeded the cushion's limit. It was obvious that Knight was still very angry about something like this. It was exactly because he disliked those people's behavior that Knight and the others chose to work on their own. They had quarreled with their families many times already, but they would never look back on things that had already been decided. The meeting room fell silent for a moment after Knight was done. Everyone knew that there was something fishy about this, but what could they do? Crouching on the high platform at the side, Hui Mao looked down at the 18 young people sitting in the meeting room. It knew that human minds were very complicated, and it was impossible for it to learn them. At most, it could learn some techniques from Cheto, but it still preferred a primitive and straightforward way of solving problems. Hui Mao was also secretly glad that it was not a human. Most people lived too sullen and tired lives, so it was better to be a cat. Folding its front legs and tucking its tail away, Hui Mao lay there with its eyes closed. It was starting to feel sleepy. Cough. C.I. Jincheng pulled everyone's attention back. Regardless, this has already happened, and our abilities are limited. The only thing we can do is to try our best. He pointed at a region on the projection and zoomed in. It was Sector R of the League of Stars' lagging sector. Sillin had been there before. Sector R was also known as the Red Sector because most of the planets there were red in color. The darker the red, the lower the habitability. Many inhabited planets only carried a faint red, not a bright red or a deeper red. But on the other hand, the darker the red, the more minerals there would be on the planet. Logically speaking, with so many red planets and minerals, this sector should be very rich. But that was not the case. Due to the abnormal magnetic field and frequent stellar flare activity of many deep red planets in Sector R, a lot of technological applications could not be applied there. If the technology could not keep up, it would definitely fall behind a lot. This was also the main reason why Sector R was classified as a lagging sector. The important factor of technology caused Sector R to inevitably fall behind many sectors in many aspects. Since technology was useless, some developers turned their attention to cheap labor. The backwater star zones had a lot of cheap labor. Therefore, just like the other backwater star zones, cheap labor was frequently traded in Sector R. Moreover, hunters would often come to this area to do some missions due to the abundance of mineral resources. This area had always been active until now. This activity also caused the epidemic to spread much more seriously than other lagging sectors after the appearance of the nightmare taper. The lagging star zones were definitely the secondary choice of the army and the large families. This time, the deployment was mainly in the trade star zones and the 3 upper star zones. This was also one of the reasons why the number of deaths in the lagging star zones was so much higher than in the trade star zones, and the number of deaths was still rising rapidly. Sector R. Yes, my plan is here. C.I. Jincheng pointed at one of the planets. There are a few large pharmaceutical factories and R&D bases on this planet. However, their performance is not good, and a few of them are on the verge of bankruptcy. Of course, this is only on the surface. Also, I suspect that there will be a miracle encampment there. Some people became spirited when they heard C.I. Jincheng's words. If Miracle's secret encampment in Sector R was real, they might be able to discover a lot of secrets and find some ways to control the current situation if they could take down that encampment. Why do you suspect that place? Knight asked. Actually, it is just one of my suspects. When I sent people to survey that planet, someone stopped me. Although the results were normal, it was so normal that it aroused my suspicions. However, I didn't have the time to carry out any official survey operation later on. As he spoke, C.I. Jincheng displayed some information. There were a lot of things wrong in the information displayed on the projection. Those who didn't understand could not see anything, but those who knew a little about medicine could see that something was wrong. What's more, C.I. Jincheng had purposely made a note at the side so that everyone could understand it. The water quality of a medicine of this level isn't recorded at all? Pride said in surprise. Based on the level of equipment shown on the information, how could these pharmaceutical factories produce pollution-free emissions? Also, the medicine production and export quantity don't match. Another person said. Yes. Other than that, I've also compared some other investigation data in the past 50 years. There are some things wrong with them, so I suspect that even if there isn't a miracle research lab there, they may have provided miracle with some basic medicine support. Many investigations C.I. Jincheng had done showed that there was something wrong with this planet. But why didn't anyone discover it during the cleanup operation? Even if it's a lagging sector and an unimportant planet, some basic surveys should be able to be carried out, shouldn't they? Someone did something to it. There are many differences between the people I sent in the name of the sector's local government and the people I found in secret. There are a few comparisons you can see here. Some of the medicines had different names on the bottles, but they contained different medicines that looked similar but were completely different from the medicines they had seen before. Most of these medicines are the same type of medicine we discovered in the 6th Legion's underground laboratory. Then what are we waiting for? Let's depart and destroy as many as we can. Those miracle people are crazy. Pride stood up and said while flexing his fingers. Let's depart first. We'll talk about the rest on the way. There's nothing we can do here anyway. Knight said. All right then, let's depart first. C.I. Jincheng had the same thought. He pressed a button on the controller in his hand, and the walls of the meeting room opened to reveal a warehouse filled with equipment. Let's tidy up the equipment first. Lung is waiting for us outside Sector C. When the others walked into the warehouse, Silan paused where he was and made a gesture to Cheto imperceptibly. What are you thinking about, Silan? C.I. Jincheng walked over and asked after turning off the projector in the meeting room. Nothing, let's go. Cheto and Hui Mao were the only ones who knew what Silan's gesture meant just now. Silan had set up an underground defense network on planet Brown Earth, and he had already activated the program implanted into the satellite array of planet Brown Earth. Right now, the entire planet was enveloped by the satellite array's defense network. Outsiders could not enter, and the people inside would not want to leave either. Planet Brown Earth was not an active planet, nor was it rich. In fact, it could be considered poor. The few planets around it were similar to it. They were poor and their neighbors were poor. This nature had saved them instead. This was because the planet where the nightmare taper appeared was a little far away from them, and it would not reach them for the time being. Moreover, after the planet's satellite defense network was forcefully activated, the planet had been quarantined. The underground network was also being activated at the impoverished old residential area. It would protect that area and the residents there, and eliminate all foreign infected people. At least, this was the only thing they could do before they found a way to deal with the nightmare taper. After receiving Silan's signal, Cheto had activated the implanted program on the other side through remote control. Moreover, it was upgraded to the highest level according to Silan's will. The 18 people in the base quickly gathered their equipment. On the spaceplane, C.I. Jincheng had already prepared everything they needed and was waiting for them to board. Be careful. Prisa said to them. Prisa was rushing to Sector S, so she could not travel with Silan and the others. All right. You be careful too. The two spaceplanes took off one after another and left Sector C. After Silan and the others met up with Lung at Sector H, they headed to Sector R together. Perhaps it was because of the nightmare taper, but young Master Lung was a lot more serious than usual. He was not laughing. Meanwhile, on a certain planet, inside a castle-like building of the Andryra family, Lung's grandfather, old Mr. Andryra Phocas, was clutching a letter to tell his grandfather in his hand. He was so angry that he blew up the entire study. It was because he heard that young Master Lung had gone missing early in the morning and left behind this bullshit letter. Where are Silan and Ci Jincheng? After sitting quietly for a while, young Master Lung got up and moved around. He asked when he did not see Silan and Ci Jincheng. The lab. They are both busy people. Knight answered with his eyes closed. Is there really no progress? Lung scratched his chin and frowned. It can't be helped. Even those so-called senior researchers couldn't come up with any good ideas. The two of them can only try their best. In reality, Silan had a sudden inspiration when he was sleeping just now. In order to seize this inspiration, he hurriedly crawled into the lab on the spaceplane and never came out again. This time, Cheto did not go to help Ci Jincheng. Everyone, including Hui Mao, had been assigned tasks by Silan. Are we really going to do this? Hui Mao looked reluctant. It's always good to try. We don't have any good ideas right now anyway. Silan patted Hui Mao's head. All right. Hui Mao sighed. Looking at the tasks Silan had assigned, Hui Mao had a feeling that he would not have time to rest for a long time. However, Silan's idea, how confident are you? Cheto asked. 30%. Right now it's just a preliminary plan. We'll know later. Silan answered. On the screen in front of Silan, an image very similar to the nightmare taper was taking shape. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.